Hey there, partner. Welcome back to another deep dive into the legendary worlds that have captivated our imaginations for decades. If you're new here, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more epic lore journeys that will transport you to realms beyond your wildest dreams. Tonight, we're riding into the dying light of the American frontier, where the thunder of hoofbeats mingles with the screech of steam engines, where honor battles greed in the hearts of desperate men, and where loyalty becomes both salvation and damnation. This is the complete timeline of Red Dead Redemption, a saga that spans generations and chronicles the bloody death throes of the Wild West itself. Picture this: a ferry dock in Blackwater, 1899. The air thick with gunpowder smoke and screams, bodies lying twisted in pools of crimson, while a young woman named Heidi McCourt draws her final breath, an innocent caught in the crossfire of ambition and desperation. In those chaotic moments, as bullets fly and dreams shatter like glass, a gang of outlaws seals their fate forever. They steal $150,000, enough to buy freedom in a far-off paradise called Tahiti, but they lose something far more valuable in return. They lose their souls. What happened on that dock would echo through the years like thunder rolling across the plains. It would tear apart a family forged by campfire bonds and blood oaths. It would transform a philosopher into a madman, a loyal son into a questioning doubter, and a dreamer into a man haunted by the weight of his own choices. The ferry job at Blackwater was meant to be their ticket to paradise, but instead it became the first domino in a chain that would topple everything they held sacred. But here's what haunts me about this tale. What keeps me coming back to these windswept plains and smoky saloons time and time again. The Blackwater ferry wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. It was the moment when the old world collided head-on with the new, when the age of the gunslinger met the age of the railroad baron, when freedom-loving outlaws discovered that progress waits for no man, not even Dutch van der Linde. You see, there's something they never tell you in the dime novels about the Wild West. The real tragedy isn't in the gunfights or the bank robberies, or even the hangings at dawn. The real tragedy is in watching good men become bad, watching families tear themselves apart, watching dreams die slow and painful deaths under the relentless march of civilization. This is a story about the last cowboys riding into a world that no longer wants them, fighting battles they can never win against enemies they can barely understand. And at the heart of it all stands Arthur Morgan, a man whose weathered hands have known both violence and tenderness, whose eyes have seen both the beauty of a sunrise over the Cumberland forest, and the ugly truth of what men become when pushed to their limits. Arthur, who starts this journey as Dutch's most loyal enforcer, questioning nothing, believing everything, ready to ride into hell itself if his surrogate father asks it of him. But something changes in Arthur during those final months of the 19th century, something that goes deeper than loyalty, deeper than family bonds, deeper than the code that held their gang together for 15 long years. As his body begins to betray him, as disease courses through his veins like poison, Arthur's eyes open to truths he never wanted to see. The question isn't whether Arthur will find redemption. The question is whether redemption can save a man who has done the unforgivable. This is the story of the Van der Linde gang, but it's also the story of America itself, caught between what it was and what it was becoming. It's the story of loyalty tested to its breaking point, of love twisted into betrayal, of hope crushed beneath the wheels of progress. It's the story of men who believed they could outrun the modern world, only to discover that you can't fight civilization with 6 shooters and dynamite. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me tell you about the last great gang of outlaws, about their rise and their fall, about their dreams of Tahiti and their reality of mud and blood. Let me tell you about Dutch van der Linde's grand vision and how it crumbled like autumn leaves. Let me tell you about Arthur Morgan's journal, filled with sketches of wildflowers and confessions of sins. Let me tell you about loyalty and betrayal, about honor among thieves, and about what happens when the world changes faster than the people living in it can adapt. Because every legend has a beginning, and this one starts with a blizzard in the mountains, with a gang of desperate outlaws fleeing through snow so deep it could bury their past, if only they'd let it. But Dutch van der Linde never was one for letting go of the past. And that, my friend, is where our story truly begins. The year is 1899, and the American frontier is bleeding to death, one railroad spike at a time, Telegraph wires stretch like spiderwebs across landscapes that once knew only the songs of wolves and the thunder of buffalo herds. In the great cities of the East, men in expensive suits draw lines on maps, carving up the wilderness with the same casual cruelty they might use to slice a Sunday roast. Progress, they call it. Manifest destiny, the march of civilization toward its inevitable triumph over the savage and the wild. But here, in the Grizzly Mountains of Amberino, winter reigns supreme over the works of man. Here, among peaks that pierce the sky like the prayers of forgotten gods, a blizzard howls with the fury of nature unleashed. Snow falls in curtains so thick they swallow horses and riders alike, transforming the world into a realm of white silence broken only by the crunch of hooves and the labored breathing of men pushed beyond their limits. Through this frozen hell rides a ghost town's worth of desperate souls. 15 men, women and children, their faces hidden beneath frost-covered scarves, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and something deeper, something that looks suspiciously like fear. They move in single file through drifts that reach their horses' bellies, following a trail that exists more in Dutch van der Linde's imagination than in any geographical reality. Dutch rides at the front, because Dutch always rides at the front. Even now, even with ice crystals clinging to his magnificent mustache and his grand plans lying in ruins somewhere behind them in Blackwater, he sits his saddle like a man born to command. 42 years old, with the bearing of a king and the tongue of a poet, Dutch van der Linde has spent the better part of 2 decades building something unprecedented in the annals of American crime. Not just a gang, but a family. Not just thieves, but philosophers with guns. Not just outlaws, but champions of a dying way of life. But kingdoms built on ideals are fragile things, and Dutch's kingdom is cracking like ice in the spring thaw. You can see it in the way his shoulders hunch against more than just the cold, in the way his eyes dart constantly to the trail behind them, searching for pursuers who might or might not be there. The Blackwater ferry job was supposed to be their masterpiece, their ticket to paradise in the South Pacific where they could live like kings on $150,000. Instead, it became their nightmare, leaving bodies in the street and turning them from respected outlaws into hunted animals. Beside him rides Arthur Morgan, and if Dutch is the head of this frozen serpent of humanity, then Arthur is surely its heart. 36 years old, built like a prizefighter who's won more fights than he's lost, Arthur possesses the kind of quiet strength that other men instinctively recognize and respect. His face, weathered by sun and wind and the weight of too many hard choices, tells the story of a life lived on the knife's edge between civilization and savagery. Arthur has followed Dutch van der Linde for 15 years, through bank robberies and train holdups, through shootouts with lawmen and battles with rival gangs. He has been Dutch's right hand, his enforcer, his most trusted son in all but blood. Where Dutch dreams and philosophizes, Arthur acts. Where Dutch inspires and commands, Arthur protects and provides. If Dutch is the gang's conscience, then Arthur is its backbone, the man who turns grand visions into bloody reality. But lately, something has been changing in Arthur Morgan. Perhaps it's the cough that's been growing worse since that business with Thomas Downs, the farmer who owed them money and paid with more than dollars. Perhaps it's the way Dutch has been listening more and more to Micah Bell's poison whispers and less to Hosea's gentle wisdom. Or perhaps it's simply that Arthur is getting older, and with age comes the terrible clarity that sees through the pretty lies we tell ourselves about who we are and what we've done. Third in line rides Hosea Matthews, and if Dutch is the gang's conscience and Arthur is its backbone, then Hosea is surely its soul. 55 years old, grey-haired and scholarly, with the gentle manner of a schoolteacher and the quick wit of a confidence man, Hosea has been Dutch's partner and oldest friend for more than 20 years. Together they built this gang from nothing, taking in lost souls and damaged goods, turning them into something resembling a family. Hosea is the voice of reason in Dutch's ear, the one who counsels caution when Dutch's ambitions run too hot, the one who remembers that their original dream was never about the money, but about freedom. About living outside the bounds of a society that had no place for men like them. But Hosea is getting old, and his influence over Dutch is waning like daylight in winter. These days, when Hosea speaks, Dutch's eyes slide toward Micah Bell, toward the man who tells him exactly what he wants to hear, rather than what he needs to know. Behind them, strung out along the treacherous mountain trail, like a broken necklace, ride the rest of the Van der Linde gang. John Marston, scarred and sullen at 26, with a woman named Abigail, and a 4-year-old son named Jack, who may or may not be his by blood, but is certainly his by choice. Sadie Adler, a recent widow whose husband was murdered by O'Driscolls just days ago, her grief so fresh it still smokes like a brand. Charles Smith, half black and half Native American, quiet and deadly and more honorable than any 10 civilized men. Micah Bell, 43 years old and rotten to his core, his very presence like a cancer, eating away at everything good the gang once represented. There are others too. Bill Williamson, loyal as a hound dog and about half as smart. Javier Escuela, a Mexican revolutionary who followed Dutch north in search of a different kind of revolution. Susan Grimshaw, the camp's unofficial mother and Dutch's sometimes lover, fierce as a mountain cat when it comes to protecting her adopted family. Karen Jones, Tilly Jackson, Mary Beth Gaskill, young women who fell through society's cracks and found something resembling home among the outlaws. Sean Maguire, an Irish hothead with more mouth than sense. Lenny Summers, barely 20 years old, but already wise beyond his years. And there are the old-timers too, the ones who remember when this life was simpler, when a gang was just men with guns instead of a family with a philosophy. Uncle, ancient and perpetually drunk but possessed of a surprising cunning when the chips are down. Reverend Orville Swanson, a man of God who lost his way and found it again in the bottom of a bottle. Leopold Strauss, the gang's loan shark, a small, precise man who understands that money is the only god that never disappoints its worshippers. This is the Van der Linde gang, 15 souls bound together by loyalty and lawlessness, by shared dreams and spilled blood. They are outcasts and outlaws, philosophers and thieves, a family forged in the crucible of the American frontier and tempered by years of running from the long arm of the law. They are the last of their kind, the final chapter in a story that began with the first cowboy who ever looked at a sheriff and decided he'd rather die free than live in chains. But families, even outlaw families, are fragile things, and as they ride through this blizzard toward an uncertain future, cracks are already showing in the foundation Dutch built so carefully over the years. The Blackwater job changed something fundamental in all of them, planted seeds of doubt that will grow into bitter fruit before this story reaches its end. For now though, they are still together, still a family, still believers in Dutch Van der Linde's grand vision of a life lived on their own terms. They don't know yet that they are riding toward their own destruction, that every mile they put between themselves and Blackwater is a mile closer to their final reckoning. All they know is the cold, the snow, and the desperate hope that somewhere ahead lies salvation. But hope, like the American frontier itself, is a dying thing in the winter of 1899. The Blackwater ferry job. Even now, months later, those 4 words hang over the Van der Linde gang like a storm cloud that refuses to break. Dutch calls it a setback, a temporary reversal in their grand march toward freedom. Hosea calls it a disaster that should have taught them valuable lessons about hubris and greed. Arthur calls it the beginning of the end, though he keeps that particular thought locked away in the private pages of his journal, hidden beneath sketches of wildlife and pressed flowers. But what actually happened on that blood-soaked dock in May of 1899 remains a mystery wrapped in gunpowder smoke and conflicting stories. The newspapers called it a massacre, painting lurid pictures of innocent civilians caught in the crossfire between outlaws and lawmen. The Pinkertons called it domestic terrorism, the work of dangerous radicals who threatened the very foundations of civilized society. Dutch called it a setup, convinced that someone had betrayed them to the authorities before they ever set foot on that ferry. The truth, as it usually does, lies somewhere in the murky waters between these competing narratives. What we know for certain is this: the Van der Linde gang had been planning the Blackwater job for months, watching the ferry schedules, studying the security arrangements, mapping out escape routes through the hills and valleys of West Elizabeth. It was supposed to be their masterpiece, the score that would set them up for life in some tropical paradise where the long arm of American law could never reach. The ferry carried wealthy passengers traveling between Blackwater and the eastern cities, men and women whose purses bulged with more money than most people saw in a lifetime. More importantly, it carried the payroll for several major businesses, neat stacks of currency bound for banks and corporate offices. Dutch estimated they could walk away with at least $100,000. maybe more if luck smiled on them the way it had during so many previous jobs. But luck, it turned out, had finally stopped smiling on Dutch van der Linde. The job went sideways from the moment they boarded the ferry. Maybe it was Micah's fault for being too quick with his gun, too eager to solve problems with violence instead of charm. Maybe it was Dutch's fault for trusting in grand gestures when careful planning would have served them better. Maybe it was simply the fault of a changing world that no longer had room for gentlemen bandits and philosophical outlaws. Whatever the cause, chaos erupted on that ferry like a prairie fire in dry grass. Guns came out, civilians screamed, and suddenly the van der Linde gang found themselves in a shooting war with half the law enforcement officers in West Elizabeth. In the confusion, people died who shouldn't have died. A young woman named Heidi McCourt, traveling to visit her sister in St. Denis, caught a bullet meant for someone else and bled out on the deck while Dutch tried desperately to restore order. That death changed something fundamental in Dutch van der Linde. Oh, he'd killed before. They all had. Bank guards who reached for their weapons too quickly, lawmen who refused to see reason, rival gang members who threatened their territory or their family. But those deaths had purpose, meaning within the context of their outlaw philosophy. Heidi McCourt died for nothing, a victim of bad planning and worse luck, and her blood stained Dutch's hands in ways that wouldn't wash clean. The gang escaped with some money, though nowhere near the fortune they dreamed of. More importantly, they escaped with their lives. Though just barely, Jenny Kirk wasn't so lucky. She took a bullet during the escape and died in Davy Calendar's arms while they fled through the hills. Davy himself lasted only long enough to see the snow-covered peaks of the Grizzlies before his own wounds claimed him. Matt Callender, Davy's brother, vanished entirely during the chaos. Some say he was captured, others whisper that he's dead, buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the West Elizabeth wilderness. But perhaps the greatest casualty of the Blackwater job wasn't any single gang member. Perhaps it was the gang's innocence, their faith in Dutch's vision of themselves as noble outlaws fighting against an unjust system. Hard to maintain such romantic notions when an innocent woman's blood is on your hands, when newspaper headlines paint you not as freedom fighters but as cold-blooded killers. Arthur feels this weight more than most. He's been Dutch's right hand for 15 years. The man who makes the hard choices so Dutch doesn't have to. He's the one who collects debts from struggling farmers, who intimidates witnesses who might testify against them, who puts bullets in men who threaten their way of life. Arthur has always told himself that these actions serve a greater purpose, that they're building something better than what civilization offers. But Blackwater shattered that comfortable fiction. How do you justify the death of someone like Heidi McCourt within the framework of Dutch's philosophy? How do you reconcile being freedom fighters with leaving bodies of innocents in your wake? These questions gnaw at Arthur like a physical pain, made worse by the cough that's been growing steadily more persistent since they fled into the mountains. The call to adventure, then, isn't some grand quest handed down by destiny or divine providence. It's something far more mundane and far more desperate. It's the simple, terrible need to survive in a world that's turned against them. The Pinkertons are tracking them with the single-minded determination of hunting hounds following a scent. Bounty hunters circle like vultures, drawn by the increasing rewards on their heads. Local law enforcement, once easily bribed or intimidated, now coordinates with federal agents armed with telegraphs and modern investigative techniques. Dutch's response to this pressure is characteristically grand and characteristically impractical. They need money to disappear properly, he argues. Not just enough for supplies and ammunition, but enough for new identities, passage to South America or the South Pacific, enough to buy their way into a completely different life. One more big score, he keeps saying. One last job, and then they can vanish forever into some tropical paradise where the rules of civilization don't apply. It's a seductive dream, this vision of Tahiti that Dutch paints in increasingly vivid colors as the weeks pass. White sand beaches and coconut trees, native girls with flowers in their hair, a life of leisure funded by American dollars stolen from American banks. No more running, no more hiding, no more looking over their shoulders for pursuing lawmen. Just freedom in its purest form, purchased with one final act of rebellion against the system that's trying to destroy them. Arthur wants to believe in this dream. God knows he's tired of running, tired of the constant fear, tired of waking up each morning wondering if this will be the day they're finally cornered by superior forces. The idea of laying down his guns forever, of finding some peace in his remaining years, appeals to him more than he's willing to admit even to himself. But Arthur is a practical man, and practical men ask practical questions. How exactly do they pull off this mythical final score, when every lawman in 3 states knows their faces? How do they trust each other when the pressure of being hunted is already starting to fray the bonds that hold them together? How do they maintain their identity as a family, when family members like Micah Bell seem more interested in personal gain than collective survival? These doubts Arthur keeps to himself, locked away with his sketches and his private thoughts. He's been Dutch's loyal son for too long to start questioning orders now, especially when questioning those orders might tear apart the only family he's ever known. But the doubts are there nonetheless, growing like shadows as the sun sets on their old way of life. The call to adventure, then, is really a call to decide what kind of men they want to be in their final chapter. Do they go out in a blaze of glory, guns blazing against impossible odds? Do they try to disappear quietly, abandoning the outlaw life for something safer but less meaningful? Or do they find some middle path, some way to honor both their principles and their need to survive? That choice will define everything that follows in their story. Spring arrives in the Heartlands like a long-awaited letter from an old friend, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings and the dangerous illusion that maybe, just maybe, the worst is behind them. The Van der Linde gang descends from their frozen exile in the Grizzlies, like ghosts returning to the world of the living, their faces pale from months of mountain snow, their spirits cautiously hopeful, as they smell grass and wild flowers for the first time since Blackwater. They make camp at a place called Horseshoe Overlook, a natural amphitheater of limestone cliffs that provides both defensible positions and scenic views of the valley below. It's the kind of place that Dutch loves, dramatic and beautiful, offering vistas that seem to stretch into infinity while keeping unwanted visitors at a respectful distance. From their perch above the Dakota River, they can see the smoke rising from Valentine's chimneys, the railroad tracks gleaming like silver threads in the afternoon sun, the endless grasslands that roll toward the horizon like a green ocean. For the first time in months, the gang allows itself to relax slightly. The immediate threat of freezing to death has passed. They have adequate shelter, fresh water, and enough game in the surrounding hills to keep them fed while they plan their next moves. More importantly, they have that most precious of commodities for wanted men. They have breathing room, a chance to think and plan instead of simply reacting to whatever crisis threatens them next. Arthur throws himself into the work of establishing their new camp with the methodical precision of a man who's done this dozens of times before. He scouts the perimeter for potential threats, identifies the best escape routes should they need to leave quickly, and sets up a rotation of guards to watch the approaches from Valentine and the railroad. These are practical concerns, the unglamorous necessities that keep outlaws alive in a world increasingly hostile to their existence. But even as Arthur tends to these mundane details, he can't shake the feeling that something fundamental has changed in their little family. Maybe it's the way Dutch spends long hours staring toward the horizon, lost in thoughts he doesn't share with anyone. Maybe it's the way Hosea's cough has gotten worse during their mountain exile, leaving the old man looking frailer and more vulnerable than Arthur has ever seen him. Maybe it's the way Micah Bell has positioned himself closer to Dutch's tent, always ready with advice that somehow always involves more violence and less patience. The gang's first forays into Valentine reveal just how much the world has changed during their brief absence from civilization. The town bustles with activity that feels different from the sleepy frontier communities they're used to terrorizing. Telegraph wires connect Valentine to distant cities, carrying news and information at speeds that would have seemed magical just a generation ago. The railroad brings fresh supplies daily, along with passengers whose clothing and mannerisms speak of Eastern refinement and modern sensibilities. Most troubling of all are the lawmen they encounter. These aren't the easily intimidated local sheriffs of the old days, men who might look the other way for the right price, or who lacked the resources to pursue criminals beyond their immediate jurisdiction. These are professionals, some of them federal agents with access to modern investigative techniques and communication networks that span the entire continent. They carry photographs of wanted men, detailed descriptions compiled by witnesses, and most unsettling of all, they seem to know far more about the Van der Linde gang than any strangers should. It's during their first cattle rustling job near Valentine that Arthur gets his clearest glimpse of what they're up against. While he and John work to move stolen livestock toward a buyer, a group of men approaches that immediately sets Arthur's instincts on high alert. They're too well dressed to be local ranchers, too well armed to be simple travelers, and they ask too many pointed questions about strangers in the area. The confrontation that follows is brief but revealing. These men aren't looking for trouble in the traditional sense. They're not trying to arrest anyone or start a gunfight. Instead, they're gathering information, taking mental notes about faces and voices and mannerisms that they'll later compile into reports sent to officers in distant cities. They represent something new and troubling in the outlaws' world. The systematic, bureaucratic approach to law enforcement that treats criminals not as romantic figures to be defeated in dramatic showdowns, but as problems to be solved through patient investigation and coordinated effort. Arthur and John escape this encounter without violence, but the experience leaves them both unsettled. The old rules no longer apply. The old methods of dealing with law enforcement, methods that served them well for over a decade, may no longer be sufficient for the challenges they face. They're not just running from individual sheriffs or even state authorities anymore. They're being hunted by a machine, a vast network of interconnected agencies that share information and coordinate strategies on a scale that individual outlaws can barely comprehend. This realization forces Dutch to confront some uncomfortable truths about their situation. The romantic vision of the outlaw life, the idea that they can maintain their independence through superior firepower and tactical cunning, becomes harder to sustain when facing opponents who have superior resources and unlimited patience. The federal government doesn't need to outgun the Van der Linde gang. It just needs to outlast them, gradually tightening the net until there's nowhere left to run. But Dutch, being Dutch, responds to this challenge not with caution or strategic retreat, but with characteristically bold ambition. If the government wants to use modern methods against them, he argues, then they'll use modern methods right back. They'll rob trains instead of stagecoaches, targeting the very symbols of progress that represent their oppression. They'll strike at banks and corporate offices, hitting the financial institutions that fund the expansion of federal power. Most importantly, they'll do it all with such style and audacity that they become legends, folk heroes whose exploits inspire others to resist the crushing advance of civilization. It's a grand vision, worthy of the man who spent 2 decades building a gang of philosophers and dreamers. But Arthur, watching Dutch outline these ambitious plans around their campfire, can't help noticing how often those plans require violence, how frequently they put innocent people at risk, how consistently they seem to benefit Dutch's ego more than the gang's actual safety. The distance between Dutch's words and actions seems to be growing wider with each passing day. John Marston, meanwhile, finds himself caught between competing loyalties that pull him in different directions with increasing intensity. On one hand, he owes everything to Dutch Van der Linde, who found him as a wild teenager and gave him purpose, family, and identity. On the other hand, he now has responsibilities that extend beyond the gang. Abigail Roberts has given him a son, 4-year-old Jack, whose innocent questions about their lifestyle are becoming harder to answer with comfortable lies. The journey that begins at Horseshoe Overlook, then, isn't just a physical movement through the geography of the American frontier. It's a spiritual and moral journey that will test every assumption the gang has made about themselves, their purpose, and their place in a rapidly changing world. They're about to discover that the real enemy isn't the government or the Pinkertons or even the March of Progress itself. The real enemy is time, and time always wins in the end. Success has a way of making men forget their limitations, and the Van der Linde gang proves no exception to this universal truth. The Cornwall train robbery, with its clean execution and substantial payoff, seems to vindicate Dutch's belief that their methods remain viable in this new century. $20,000 buys more than supplies and ammunition. It purchases something far more valuable and far more dangerous. It buys hope. Around the campfire at Horseshoe Overlook, as the evening light fades into purple twilight and the first stars appear over the Dakota River, Dutch holds court like a king addressing his loyal subjects. His voice carries the same magnetic confidence that first drew these lost souls to his banner years ago, weaving tales of their recent victory into a larger narrative about their destiny as free men in an unfree world. The money they took from Cornwall's train isn't just stolen wealth, he argues. It's liberation tax, collected from those who profit from the systematic oppression of honest folk. The gang listens with the eager attention of believers hearing their favorite sermon. Javier Escuela nods along with Dutch's philosophical flourishes, his own revolutionary background making him particularly receptive to arguments about fighting unjust authority. Bill Williamson, simpler in his thinking but no less devoted, focuses on the practical implications. If they can pull off jobs like this regularly, maybe they really can accumulate enough money to disappear forever. Even John Marston, usually skeptical of Dutch's grander pronouncements, finds himself caught up in the optimism that permeates their temporary home. Only Hosea maintains his characteristic reserve, watching Dutch's performance with the careful attention of a man who's seen this particular show many times before. He recognizes the signs of his old friend's enthusiasm taking hold, the way Dutch's natural charisma becomes amplified when he senses an audience receptive to his message. Hosea has watched Dutch inspire men to incredible acts of courage and loyalty over the years, but he's also watched that same inspiration lead them into disasters that cooler heads might have avoided. The false conclusion that emerges from their recent success is seductive in its simplicity. Maybe the world hasn't changed as much as they feared. Maybe the old ways still work for those bold enough to embrace them. Maybe the reports of increasing federal coordination and sophisticated investigation techniques have been exaggerated by nervous lawmen trying to justify their failures. Maybe the Van der Linde gang, with their superior planning and execution, can continue to stay one step ahead of whatever forces oppose them. This optimism manifests itself in increasingly ambitious planning sessions that stretch late into the night. Dutch spreads maps across makeshift tables, marking potential targets with the enthusiasm of a general planning a campaign. Railroad lines that carry corporate payrolls, banks in growing towns that lack adequate security, wealthy ranchers whose herds could be rustled and sold in distant markets. The opportunities seem limitless for men willing to take calculated risks and work together as a coordinated unit. Arthur participates in these planning sessions with growing unease that he struggles to articulate. On the surface, Dutch's arguments make perfect sense. They've just proven their continued effectiveness with the Cornwall job. They have adequate resources, secure camp, and high morale among the gang members. The opposition, while potentially formidable, hasn't actually caught them yet, despite months of supposed intensive investigation. Why shouldn't they press their advantages while they still possess them? But Arthur's instincts, refined by years of dangerous living, detect subtle changes in their situation that statistical analysis might miss. The quality of their opposition has improved, even if their quantity hasn't dramatically increased. The communications networks that connect law enforcement agencies operate faster and more efficiently than ever before. Most troubling of all, their own internal dynamics seem to be shifting in ways that could prove catastrophic under pressure. Micah Bell's influence over Dutch continues to grow with each successful job, each validation of the aggressive tactics that Hosea's gentler approach might have rejected. Where the old partnership between Dutch and Hosea was built on mutual respect and complementary strengths, this new alliance with Micah seems based on mutual reinforcement of existing prejudices and impulses. Micah tells Dutch exactly what he wants to hear, when he wants to hear it, with precisely the tone of righteous indignation that appeals to Dutch's sense of himself as a misunderstood philosopher. The transformation reveals itself in small but significant ways. Dutch begins cutting Hosea off in mid-sentence during strategic discussions, dismissing concerns about increased security or federal coordination as unnecessary pessimism. He spends more time consulting with Micah about tactical details, treating the newer gang member as an equal partner despite his relatively recent arrival and questionable background. Most ominously, he starts talking about their enemies in more personal terms, as if the conflict has become a matter of individual honor rather than practical survival. Arthur notices these changes, but finds himself trapped by the very loyalty that has defined his relationship with Dutch for 15 years. How do you tell your surrogate father that he's making mistakes without seeming disloyal or ungrateful? How do you express concerns about the gang's direction without undermining the unity that has always been their greatest strength? How do you question decisions made by the man who saved your life and gave you purpose when you were nothing but a wild kid with a quick gun and no future? These internal conflicts come to a head during a quiet conversation between Arthur and Hosea while the rest of the gang sleeps. The older man's health has been deteriorating steadily since their mountain exile, his persistent cough and increasing frailty serving as stark reminders of his mortality. But his mind remains sharp and his understanding of Dutch's psychology runs deeper than anyone else's in the gang. Hosea shares Arthur's concerns about their current trajectory, but he frames them in terms of historical patterns rather than immediate threats. He's seen Dutch go through cycles like this before, periods of extraordinary confidence followed by equally dramatic reversals. The problem isn't Dutch's fundamental character, which remains essentially good despite his flaws. The problem is his susceptibility to flattery and his tendency to interpret success as validation of his philosophical worldview, rather than the result of careful planning and favorable circumstances. The conversation provides Arthur with valuable perspective on their situation, but it also highlights the fundamental dilemma facing anyone who cares about Dutch's welfare. Direct confrontation will only drive him further into Micah's sphere of influence, while passive acceptance risks enabling increasingly dangerous behavior. The gang needs Dutch's leadership and charisma to maintain cohesion, but they also need someone to provide the reality checks that keep ambitious plans grounded in practical possibilities. As summer progresses at Horseshoe Overlook, this tension between optimism and caution plays out in dozens of small decisions that collectively determine their future course. Dutch pushes for bigger scores and bolder tactics, while Hosea advocates for patience and careful preparation. Arthur finds himself caught between these competing visions, his loyalty to Dutch warring with his respect for Hosea's experience and wisdom. The false conclusion that emerges from their recent success isn't entirely wrong. They do retain formidable capabilities as organized criminals. They do possess advantages in mobility and local knowledge that partially offset their enemies' superior resources. They do maintain the kind of internal cohesion that allows them to execute complex operations with remarkable efficiency. But success has also bred a dangerous complacency that blinds them to the subtle but significant ways their situation has deteriorated since Blackwater. The Cornwall robbery wasn't just a successful job, it was a declaration of war against forces that possess both the means and the motivation to wage that war more effectively than any opponents they've previously faced. The question isn't whether they can continue their current activities, but whether they can survive the inevitable escalation that their recent success has triggered. That escalation, Arthur suspects, will test every assumption they've made about their own capabilities and the nature of the world they're fighting against. The move to Clemens Point comes with the changing seasons, as if the gang's migration south mirrors the natural rhythms of creatures seeking warmer climates and easier living. The new camp perches on a finger of land that juts into Flatiron Lake, providing natural barriers on three sides and commanding views of the surrounding countryside. It's more exposed than Horseshoe Overlook, but also more beautiful, with Spanish moss draping ancient oak trees and the gentle lapping of lake water, providing a constant soothing soundtrack to their daily activities. Dutch chooses this location for reasons that go beyond mere tactical considerations. The scenic beauty appeals to his aesthetic sensibilities, providing a stage worthy of the philosophical drama he believes himself to be directing. But more practically, Clemens Point offers proximity to the Braithwaite and Gray family plantations, where old money and older grudges create opportunities for the kind of complex schemes that Dutch prefers to simple robbery. The Lemoyne region represents everything that's simultaneously fascinating and troubling about the post-Civil War South. Magnificent mansions stand like monuments to vanished prosperity, their columned facades and manicured gardens maintained through stubborn pride rather than actual wealth. The families who built these estates on the backs of enslaved labor now cling to their social positions through increasingly desperate measures, their genteel facades concealing bitter feuds and criminal enterprises that would make hardened outlaws blush. Into this powder keg of resentment and faded grandeur comes the Linde gang, drawn by Dutch's conviction that they can play these ancient enemies against each other for mutual profit. It's a strategy that appeals to his sense of himself as a master manipulator, someone who can navigate complex social dynamics while maintaining his own moral superiority. After all, what could be more justified than taking money from people whose wealth was built on the suffering of others? The Gray family presents themselves as respectable citizens of Rhodes, pillars of the community who've successfully transitioned from antebellum plantation owners to modern business leaders. Sheriff Lee Gray controls local law enforcement with the casual efficiency of someone born to authority, while his relatives manage various legitimate and semi-legitimate enterprises throughout the region. But beneath their veneer of respectability lies a network of criminal activities that rivals anything the Van der Linde gang has ever attempted. The Braithwaites, by contrast, make no pretense of respectability. Catherine Braithwaite rules her family's moonshine empire with the iron discipline of a military commander, using violence and intimidation to maintain market share in an increasingly competitive business. Her sons and nephews serve as enforcers and distributors, carrying out feuds that stretch back generations while building new ones through their own actions. Where the Greys hide their criminality behind social position, the Braithwaites embrace it as a necessary tool for survival in a world that has moved beyond their traditional sources of power. Dutch's plan for exploiting this situation demonstrates both his strategic brilliance and his growing disconnection from practical realities. The gang will play both sides, he explains during one of his increasingly frequent philosophical monologues. They'll run guns to the Grey family's private militia, while simultaneously providing security for Braithwaite moonshine operations. Each side will pay them for services rendered while remaining unaware of their double dealing. Eventually, when the inevitable confrontation erupts between the families, the Van der Linde gang will position themselves to profit from whatever chaos ensues. It's an elegant scheme in theory, the kind of complex manipulation that appeals to Dutch's image of himself as a sophisticated criminal mastermind. But Arthur, listening to these grand pronouncements while cleaning his weapons by the lake shore, can't shake the feeling that they're walking into something far more dangerous than Dutch realizes. The Greys and Braithwaites have been feuding for decades. They understand each other's capabilities and limitations in ways that outsiders never could. They've survived this long precisely because they're skilled at identifying and eliminating threats to their operations. The first jobs for both families go smoothly enough to reinforce Dutch's confidence in his strategy. A midnight gun run to Grey supporters nets them several $100s and establishes their credentials as reliable partners. A similar operation for the Braithwaites, protecting a moonshine shipment from federal agents, proves equally profitable and seemingly risk-free. Both families express satisfaction with the gang's performance and hint at larger, more lucrative opportunities on the horizon. But Arthur begins noticing details that suggest their employers are more aware of their double dealing than Dutch assumes. Sheriff Grey asks pointed questions about their other activities in the region, questions that seem designed to test their honesty rather than gather information. Catherine Braithwaite makes cryptic comments about loyalty and trust that carry unmistakable undertones of threat. Both families deploy watchers who shadow gang members during their visits, ostensibly for security but actually to gather intelligence about their movements and associates. The deeper they penetrate into Lemoyne's criminal underworld, the more Arthur realizes that they're not manipulating these families so much as being absorbed by them. The Greys and Braithwaites possess resources and connections that dwarf anything the Van der Linde gang has ever commanded. They own judges, control juries, and maintain private armies that could crush any opposition through sheer weight of numbers. Most importantly, they understand the local terrain, both geographical and political, in ways that give them enormous advantages over outsiders. This dawning awareness coincides with troubling changes in Arthur's own physical condition. The cough that started as a minor irritation following his confrontation with Thomas Downs has gradually worsened, accompanied by fatigue and occasional shortness of breath that he initially attributes to stress and poor sleep. But the symptoms persist and intensify despite the relatively peaceful conditions at Clemens Point, suggesting something more serious than temporary illness. Arthur keeps these health concerns to himself, unwilling to burden the gang with additional worries when they're already navigating dangerous political waters. But the growing weakness affects his performance in subtle ways, slowing his reactions and reducing his stamina during extended operations. More troubling still, it forces him to confront his own mortality in ways that fundamentally alter his perspective on their activities. If Arthur has limited time remaining, how does he want to spend it? If these are potentially his last months or years, what legacy does he want to leave behind? These existential questions gain urgency as his physical condition deteriorates, transforming abstract philosophical concerns into immediate practical decisions about how to live and what to value. The gang's increasing involvement with the feuding families also provides Arthur with unwelcome insights into the long-term consequences of criminal behavior. Both the Greys and Braithwaites trapped themselves in cycles of violence and retribution that have consumed generations of their descendants. Children grow up expecting to inherit their parents' enemies along with their property. Young men die in pointless confrontations over slights that occurred before they were born. Entire family lines define themselves by hatred rather than love, by what they oppose rather than what they support. Arthur sees uncomfortable parallels between these generational feuds and the Van der Linde gang's own trajectory. Dutch's philosophy of resistance to unjust authority, noble in its original conception, has gradually transformed into something darker and more personal. The gang no longer fights for abstract principles of freedom and justice. They fight because fighting is what they know, because violence has become their primary tool for solving problems, because they've invested too much in their outlaw identity to imagine any alternative. The peaceful interludes at Clemens Point, when the gang gathers around their campfire for songs and stories, take on bittersweet poignancy as Arthur contemplates these larger patterns. These moments of genuine affection and camaraderie represent the best of what Dutch originally envisioned when he founded their surrogate family. But they're increasingly overshadowed by the compromises and moral failures that sustain their way of life. Hosea shares Arthur's growing unease about their situation, though he frames his concerns differently, where Arthur worries about immediate threats and long-term consequences. Hosea focuses on the changes he observes in Dutch's character and decision-making. The man who once agonized over every civilian casualty now dismisses such concerns as sentimentality that weakens their effectiveness. The leader who once insisted on unanimous consent for major decisions now expects unquestioning obedience to his increasingly autocratic pronouncements. These character changes aren't sudden or dramatic enough to provoke open rebellion, but they're significant enough to alter the gang's internal dynamics in fundamental ways. Members who once felt free to express dissenting opinions now find themselves marginalized if their views conflict with Dutch's preferred narrative. The democratic elements that once balanced Dutch's natural authoritarianism are gradually being eroded by his increasing reliance on Micah Bell's counsel and his growing impatience with anything that slows down his decision-making process. As summer deepens into the sweltering heat of Lemoyne, Arthur finds himself caught between competing loyalties that seem increasingly irreconcilable. His devotion to Dutch remains strong, rooted in 15 years of shared experiences and genuine affection. But his commitment to the gang's original principles conflicts with their current activities, while his growing awareness of his own mortality makes every moral compromise feel like a betrayal of whatever time he has left. The move to Saint Denis brings the Van der Linde gang face to face with everything their way of life has been designed to resist. Here in the pulsing heart of modern Louisiana, electric streetlights banish the romantic darkness that has always concealed their activities. Automobiles share cobblestone streets with horse-drawn carriages, their mechanical roar drowning out the natural sounds that have guided outlaws through countless escapes. Telegraph wires form an invisible web above their heads, carrying information at speeds that make traditional methods of evading pursuit seem laughably obsolete. Their new hideout at Shady Belle represents both the pinnacle of their material success and the nadir of their moral compromise. The former plantation house, grand enough to accommodate their entire extended family, stands as a monument to wealth built on human suffering. Its elegant columns and sweeping verandas speak of antebellum prosperity, while the neglected slave quarters behind the main house bear silent witness to the human cost of such prosperity. Dutch chooses this location for practical reasons, but the symbolism feels uncomfortably apt for a gang that has gradually abandoned its principles in pursuit of survival. Angelo Bronte's influence permeates their Saint Denis operations, like humidity on a summer day, invisible but inescapable. The Italian crime boss has taken an interest in these rustic outlaws that goes beyond simple amusement at their primitive methods. He sees potential in their violence and loyalty, qualities that could prove useful in his own sophisticated criminal enterprises. But his cultivation of their services comes with strings attached, obligations that gradually transform them from independent operators into subordinate elements in a larger criminal organization. The bank robbery that Dutch proposes represents the culmination of months of increasingly desperate planning and the ultimate test of their ability to operate in this modern criminal landscape. The Lemoyne National Bank sits at the heart of Saint Denis, like a fortress of capitalism, its steel vault and armed guards protecting not just money, but the entire system of financial power that governs the modern world. To rob it successfully would prove that the old ways still possess relevance in this new century. To fail would confirm what many already suspect, that their time has passed and their methods have become obsolete. But the job that was supposed to secure their financial future instead becomes the catalyst for the gang's final disintegration. The robbery itself succeeds beyond their wildest expectations, netting them thousands of dollars and proving that their tactical abilities remain formidable despite the changing times. For a few glorious hours, it seems as though Dutch's vision might actually work, that careful planning and coordinated execution can overcome any obstacle that modern society places in their path. The trap that springs around them as they attempt to escape reveals the true sophistication of their enemies and the complete inadequacy of their traditional responses to such threats. This isn't the chaotic pursuit by local lawmen that they've evaded dozens of times before. This is a coordinated operation involving federal agents, Pinkerton detectives, and local police working together with military precision. Every escape route has been identified and blocked. Every possible hiding place has been searched and secured. Every member of their organization has been catalogued and tracked. Hosea Matthews dies in the chaos that follows, cut down by federal agents while trying to create a distraction that might allow his younger gang members to escape. His death strikes Arthur like a physical blow, not just because of personal affection but because of what it represents about their situation. Hosea embodied the best aspects of their outlaw philosophy, the gentle wisdom that tempered Dutch's more extreme impulses. With his death, the last moderating influence on Dutch's decision-making disappears, leaving the field clear for Micah Bell's poison to work its way deeper into the gang's bloodstream. John Marston's capture compounds the disaster in ways that go beyond simple personnel losses. John represents the gang's future, the younger generation that might have carried their traditions forward into whatever world emerges from the chaos of the 20th century. His imprisonment by federal authorities means that future has been stolen from them, replaced by the grim certainty that their enemies possess both the will and the ability to destroy everything they've built over 2 decades of careful cultivation. The gang's flight from Saint Denis takes on the desperate character of wounded animals seeking shelter from predators that possess every advantage except the will to survive. They flee not toward any specific destination but simply away from the overwhelming force that threatens to crush them entirely. The boats that carry them across the waters toward Gama represent more than just transportation. They represent the final abandonment of everything that once defined their identity as American outlaws. Arthur's physical condition deteriorates rapidly during this period of extreme stress, his tubercular symptoms exacerbated by poor nutrition, inadequate rest, and the constant anxiety of being hunted by superior forces. The persistent cough that he's tried to hide for months becomes impossible to conceal, while his obvious weight loss and diminished stamina concern even gang members too preoccupied with their own survival to pay close attention to others' health problems. But more significant than Arthur's physical decline is his growing moral clarity about their situation and his own role in creating it. The violence of the Saint Denis job, with its civilian casualties and pointless brutality, forces him to confront the distance between Dutch's noble rhetoric and their actual behavior. They're no longer freedom fighters resisting unjust authority. They're simply criminals whose methods have become indistinguishable from those of the corrupt officials they claim to oppose. This realization crystallizes during a quiet moment aboard their escape vessel, as Arthur watches the Louisiana coastline disappear into morning mist. Everything he's done for the past 15 years, every act of violence and intimidation, every moral compromise justified by loyalty to Dutch's vision, has led to this moment of complete defeat. They've become exactly what Dutch always claimed to be fighting against: parasites who prey on honest people while justifying their predation through elaborate philosophical frameworks. The revelation that transforms Arthur's understanding of their situation comes not through dramatic confrontation, but through gradual accumulation of evidence that becomes impossible to ignore. Micah Bell's influence over Dutch hasn't happened by accident or through superior persuasive ability. It's been cultivated deliberately, systematically, by someone who understands exactly how to manipulate Dutch's psychological weaknesses and exploit his growing paranoia about external threats. Micah's suggestions consistently push the gang toward more violent and less sustainable methods of operation. His advice reliably isolates Dutch from voices of moderation and experience. Most significantly, his presence in their organization coincides perfectly with the escalation of law enforcement attention that has made their traditional lifestyle impossible to maintain. These patterns could be explained by coincidence or poor judgment, but Arthur's instincts suggest something far more sinister. The possibility that Micah Bell has been working as an informant for their enemies explains so much about their recent disasters that Arthur finds it difficult to dismiss, despite his reluctance to believe that Dutch could be so thoroughly deceived. The Blackwater job went wrong in ways that suggested inside knowledge of their plans. The Gray and Braithwaite manipulation collapsed despite careful preparation. The St. Denis bank robbery succeeded tactically but failed strategically because their enemies were prepared for exactly the kind of operation they attempted. This growing suspicion about Micah's true loyalties creates an agonizing dilemma for Arthur. If he's correct about the betrayal, then warning Dutch becomes a matter of urgent necessity for the gang's survival. But if he's wrong, or if Dutch refuses to believe such accusations against his new favorite advisor, then voicing these suspicions could destroy what little unity remains among the surviving gang members. The very loyalty that has always been Arthur's greatest strength now becomes a source of paralyzing doubt about how to protect the people he cares about most. The tropical exile that awaits them in Gorma promises no relief from these mounting pressures. If anything, their isolation in a foreign country with hostile authorities and no local allies will intensify the internal conflicts that are already tearing their organization apart. Arthur understands, with the clarity that comes from approaching one's own mortality, that their time as a functional criminal enterprise has effectively ended. The question is no longer whether the Van der Linde gang will survive, but whether anything worth preserving will emerge from its inevitable dissolution. Dutch's response to these mounting crises reveals the complete transformation of his character that has been building since Blackwater. The philosophical leader who once agonized over moral complications now embraces violence as the solution to every problem. The collaborative decision-maker who once sought consensus among his followers now demands unquestioning obedience to increasingly erratic commands. Most troubling of all, the surrogate father who once protected his adopted family now seems willing to sacrifice anyone and everyone in pursuit of his own survival and vindication. Arthur watches this transformation with growing horror, recognizing that the man he's followed for 15 years may no longer exist, except as a memory of what Dutch van der Linde once represented. The question becomes not whether to remain loyal to Dutch, but whether loyalty to Dutch's original vision requires opposing what he's become. That moral complexity will define everything that follows in their story, as Arthur struggles to reconcile his love for his surrogate father with his responsibility to protect the innocent people, still trapped within their dying organization. Gorma reveals itself as purgatory disguised as paradise, a tropical island where the Van der Linde gang discovers that geography provides no escape from the fundamental contradictions that have been consuming them from within. The azure waters and palm fronds that should represent freedom instead become another prison, one where the bars consist of political corruption, corporate exploitation, and the growing realization that their American problems have followed them across international waters. The sugar plantation that dominates the island operates with the casual brutality of an earlier era, its Cuban workers laboring under conditions that make the worst American factories seem humane by comparison. Feuds, the military strongman who controls local government through a combination of Spanish colonial authority and personal violence, represents everything Dutch has always claimed to oppose. Yet here they are, forced into alliance with exactly the kind of oppressive figure their philosophy was designed to resist. Dutch's enthusiastic embrace of this new revolutionary cause provides Arthur with the clearest possible view of how completely his leader's moral compass has been corrupted. The man who once spoke eloquently about fighting for the oppressed now allies himself with their oppressors whenever such alliances serve his immediate needs. The philosopher who built a gang around principles of justice and freedom now treats those principles as rhetorical tools to be deployed or abandoned based on tactical convenience. Arthur's tuberculosis advances relentlessly during their tropical exile, the disease feeding on stress, poor nutrition, and the humid climate that seems designed to accelerate his physical decline. The persistent cough that once troubled him occasionally now racks his entire frame with increasing frequency, while the weight loss that was once subtle becomes impossible to hide from his concerned companions. But more than physical deterioration, the disease forces Arthur to confront the limited time remaining to him and the legacy he wants to leave behind. The revelation that reshapes Arthur's understanding of their entire situation comes not through dramatic confrontation, but through careful observation of patterns that become impossible to ignore, once examined closely. Micah Bell's behavior throughout their various crises follows a consistent logic that has nothing to do with gang loyalty or survival instincts. His suggestions consistently worsen their strategic position while appearing to offer tactical advantages. His advice reliably increases their exposure to law enforcement while seeming to address immediate threats. Most damning of all, Micah's presence in key locations often coincides with law enforcement operations that suggest inside knowledge of gang activities. The Strawberry jailbreak that should have been a simple extraction becomes a complex firefight with unusually well-prepared defenders. The Valentine bank job that seemed perfectly planned encounters resistance that suggests advance warning. The pattern extends back to Blackwater itself, where the ferry robbery collapsed in ways that indicated their enemies possessed detailed knowledge of timing, personnel, and tactical approaches. Arthur pieces together this evidence with the methodical care of a man who understands that accusations of betrayal must be supported by irrefutable proof. Micah joined the gang only months before Blackwater, arriving with impressive credentials but no verifiable history with other criminal organizations. His integration into their operations proceeded with suspicious smoothness, as if he already understood their methods and capabilities better than any newcomer should. Most significantly, his influence over Dutch grew at precisely the rate necessary to neutralize voices of moderation and experience that might have questioned his loyalties. The realization that they've been betrayed from within explains so much about their recent disasters that Arthur finds himself wondering how he could have been so blind to the obvious signs. But understanding Micah's treachery creates new problems that may be even more difficult to solve than ignorance was. Dutch's psychological dependence on his new advisor has reached pathological levels, with Micah's validation becoming essential to Dutch's sense of himself as a capable leader. Challenging that relationship directly will likely trigger exactly the kind of paranoid reaction that could destroy what little unity remains among the surviving gang members. The tropical setting provides Arthur with unexpected opportunities for reflection that might not have been available amid the constant pressures of their American operations. Long walks along beaches where Spanish conquistadors once landed, conversations with Cuban revolutionaries who fought their own battles against oppressive authority, and quiet moments watching sunsets that remind him of childhood evenings when the world seemed full of infinite possibility rather than narrowing choices. These peaceful interludes allow Arthur to examine his own role in the gang's trajectory with painful honesty. How many of their moral compromises did he enable through unquestioning obedience to Dutch's increasingly questionable commands? How many innocent people suffered because he prioritized loyalty over conscience during crucial moments when a different choice might have changed everything? How many opportunities for redemption did he miss because he was too comfortable with his identity as Dutch's enforcer to imagine any alternative role for himself? The journal that Arthur has kept throughout their adventures becomes increasingly introspective during this period, filled with philosophical musings that would have seemed alien to the man who began this journey as a simple gunslinger with unquestioning faith in his leader's vision. He writes about the difference between loyalty and enabling, about the moral obligations that come with physical strength, about the possibility of finding meaning and purpose even when the institutional frameworks that once provided such things have collapsed entirely. But the most significant revelation that emerges during their Gama exile concerns not the gang's external enemies, but the internal dynamics that have been destroying them from within. Dutch's gradual transformation from collaborative leader to authoritarian ruler didn't happen overnight, or through external manipulation alone. It resulted from character flaws that were always present but previously held in check by Hosea's moderating influence, and the practical necessities of maintaining group cohesion. Arthur recognizes, with the clarity that comes from approaching one's own death, that Dutch's fundamental problem isn't corruption by bad advisors or pressure from external enemies. It's an inability to distinguish between his personal desires and his philosophical principles, a tendency to rationalize selfish behavior through elaborate moral frameworks that sound noble but serve primarily to justify whatever actions he wants to take regardless of their consequences for others. This insight forces Arthur to confront an even more painful truth about his own past choices. His loyalty to Dutch wasn't based on careful evaluation of the man's character or thoughtful agreement with his philosophical positions. It was based on gratitude for rescue from a meaningless existence and fear of returning to the emptiness that preceded his adoption into the gang family. He followed Dutch not because Dutch was right, but because following Dutch was easier than developing his own moral framework and taking responsibility for his own choices. The recognition of these uncomfortable truths about both Dutch and himself creates space for Arthur to begin imagining different ways of living whatever time remains to him. If loyalty based on gratitude and fear has led him to enable terrible acts, perhaps loyalty based on conscience and love might lead him toward redemption. If unquestioning obedience to authority has resulted in moral compromise, perhaps thoughtful resistance to harmful commands might create opportunities for positive change. John Marston's absence during their tropical exile serves as a constant reminder of the stakes involved in these philosophical deliberations. John represents everything that Arthur hopes might be preserved from the wreckage of their organization. He's young enough to build a different kind of life, devoted enough to his family to prioritize their welfare over abstract principles, and practical enough to abandon romantic notions about outlaw glory in favor of genuine security and happiness. Arthur begins to understand that his own redemption, if such a thing is possible for someone with his history, might come through ensuring John's escape from the cycles of violence and retribution that have consumed so many other promising young men. Not just physical escape, but psychological and moral escape from the worldview that treats violence as the solution to every problem and loyalty as an excuse for avoiding personal responsibility. The political situation on Gorma provides an ironic backdrop for these personal revelations. The Cuban revolutionaries fighting against Spanish colonial authority embody everything that Dutch claims to represent, but their methods and motivations differ dramatically from the Van der Linde gang's approach to resistance. These revolutionaries fight for their families and communities rather than abstract principles. They seek to build something better rather than simply destroying what they oppose. Most importantly, they maintain clear moral boundaries that prevent them from becoming indistinguishable from their oppressors. Arthur observes these differences with growing understanding of what the gang might have become under different leadership or with different priorities. But he also recognizes that such speculation serves no practical purpose given their current situation. The question isn't what they might have been, but what they can still become in whatever time remains to them. For Arthur personally, that question has become urgent given his advancing illness and the likelihood that his remaining months will be his last opportunity to create a legacy worth remembering. The return journey to America looms ahead of them like a reckoning that can no longer be postponed or avoided. They will carry back with them not just the physical scars of their tropical adventure, but the psychological weight of everything they've learned about themselves and each other during their forced exile. The gang that returns to Louisiana will be fundamentally different from the one that fled Saint Denis, not because of external changes, but because of internal revelations that have made their previous way of life impossible to sustain. The first sign that their careful manipulation of the Gray and Braithwaite families has gone catastrophically wrong comes not through violence or confrontation, but through an absence that speaks louder than any gunshot. 4-year-old Jack Marston, John and Abigail's son, vanishes from their camp at Clemens Point, like morning mist dissolving in sunlight. One moment he's playing with wooden toys near the water's edge, the next he's simply gone, leaving behind only his mother's anguished screams, and a growing certainty that someone has taken the gang's most innocent member as leverage in a game whose rules none of them fully understood. The revelation that follows strikes the Van der Linde gang like a physical blow. Catherine Braithwaite, the moonshine matriarch whose operations they've been protecting for weeks, orchestrated Jack's kidnapping as retaliation for their double dealing with the Gray family. But worse than simple revenge, she sold the boy to Angelo Bronte, a mysterious Italian crime boss who operates from the sophisticated urban maze of Saint Denis. Jack isn't just missing. He's become a commodity in a criminal marketplace that operates by rules far more complex and dangerous than anything they've previously encountered. Dutch's response to this crisis reveals the complete transformation of his character that has been building for months. Gone is the philosophical leader who once agonized over civilian casualties and moral complications. In his place stands a man consumed by fury and self-righteousness. Someone who views Jack's kidnapping not as the predictable consequence of their own reckless schemes, but as an unprovoked attack on everything he holds sacred. The Braithwaite family must pay for their betrayal, he declares, and payment will be extracted through the total destruction of everything they've built over generations. The assault on Braithwaite Manor unfolds with the terrible efficiency of men whose patience has finally snapped. Arthur, despite his growing physical weakness and moral reservations, finds himself swept along by the momentum of collective rage that grips the entire gang. They ride through the night like an army of vengeance, their faces grim with purpose as they approach the columned mansion that represents everything Dutch has taught them to despise about inherited privilege and unearned authority. The battle itself proves shockingly one-sided. For all their criminal enterprises and violent reputations, the Braithwaites are unprepared for the coordinated assault that Dutch unleashes upon them. Their private security, adequate for intimidating local rivals and federal agents, crumbles before the concentrated firepower and tactical expertise that the Van der Linde gang brings to bear. Within minutes, the defenders are either dead or fleeing, leaving Catherine Braithwaite alone in her burning mansion to face the consequences of her miscalculation. Arthur watches Dutch interrogate the defiant matriarch with growing unease that has nothing to do with sympathy for their enemy. The man conducting this interrogation bears only superficial resemblance to the leader who once spoke eloquently about justice and moral necessity. This Dutch employs threats and intimidation with casual efficiency, treating human life as a resource to be expended in pursuit of his goals. When Catherine finally breaks and reveals Jack's location, Dutch's satisfaction has an edge of cruelty that Arthur has never seen before. But the rescue of Jack Marston, while successful, comes at a cost that extends far beyond the immediate destruction they've wrought. Angelo Bronte proves to be something entirely new in their experience, a criminal whose sophistication and resources make even their most ambitious schemes seem primitive by comparison. He operates from the heart of Saint Denis like a shadow mayor, controlling politicians and police through a combination of bribery, blackmail, and carefully applied violence. His criminal empire spans multiple states and connects to similar organizations in distant cities, creating a network of power that dwarfs anything the Van der Linde gang has ever imagined. Bronte returns Jack unharmed, but the gesture carries unmistakable undertones of both superiority and warning. He could have kept the boy, his manner suggests, or sold him to far worse people than the Braithwaites. His willingness to return the child stems not from fear of retaliation, but from amused condescension toward what he clearly regards as rustic amateurs, playing at sophisticated criminality. The Van der Linde gang, in Bronte's worldview, represents everything that modern crime has evolved beyond. They're relics of a simpler time when criminals operated in isolation rather than as components of larger organizational structures. The encounter forces Arthur to confront uncomfortable truths about their position in the evolving criminal landscape. The old model of outlaw gangs, built on personal loyalty and territorial independence, is rapidly becoming obsolete in a world where successful criminals operate like businessmen rather than warriors. Bronte's organization possesses advantages in coordination, intelligence gathering, and political corruption that make traditional law enforcement seem almost quaint by comparison. Against such opponents, the Van der Linde gang's superior gunfighting skills and mobility provide only temporary advantages. These revelations coincide with increasingly obvious signs that Arthur's health continues to deteriorate, despite his efforts to hide the symptoms from his fellow gang members. The persistent cough has worsened to the point where it occasionally prevents him from sleeping, while unexplained weight loss makes his clothes hang loose on a frame that once bulged with hard-earned muscle. Most alarming of all, he sometimes finds himself short of breath after activities that should barely challenge someone of his physical conditioning. Arthur begins to suspect that his confrontation with Thomas Downs carried consequences that extend far beyond moral complications. The farmer's tubercular cough, which seemed like such a minor detail at the time, may have transmitted something far more serious than guilt about collecting debts from dying men. If Arthur has contracted tuberculosis, his remaining time may be measured in months rather than years, a possibility that fundamentally alters his perspective on everything the gang is trying to accomplish. This growing awareness of his own mortality coincides with equally troubling changes in the gang's internal dynamics. Micah Bell's influence over Dutch has reached the point where other gang members begin to notice and comment on the shift. Hosea's gentle warnings are dismissed with increasing frequency, while Micah's aggressive counsel receives enthusiastic endorsement. The collaborative leadership style that once characterized Dutch's approach has given way to something approaching autocracy, with dissenting voices increasingly marginalized or ignored entirely. John Marston, meanwhile, struggles with his own complex reactions to recent events. Jack's kidnapping has forced him to confront the tension between his loyalty to the gang and his responsibilities as a father. Abigail's terror during their son's absence, her desperate pleas for John to prioritize family over gang obligations, creates emotional conflicts that he lacks the experience or vocabulary to resolve effectively. The romantic appeal of the outlaw life becomes harder to maintain when it puts innocent children at risk through no fault of their own. Charles Smith and Sadie Adler represent different responses to these mounting pressures. Charles, with his mixed heritage and natural wisdom, observes the gang's trajectory with the detached clarity of someone who understands that all things pass, that even the strongest bonds eventually strain beyond their breaking point. He remains loyal but prepares mentally for the possibility that this family, like all families, may eventually dissolve under the weight of external pressures and internal contradictions. Sadie, by contrast, finds in the gang's increasing violence an outlet for her own grief and rage over her husband's murder. Where others see troubling escalation, she sees long overdue justice being visited upon those who profit from others' suffering. Her enthusiasm for violent solutions aligns perfectly with Micah's influence over Dutch, creating another voice that reinforces the very tendencies that Hosea and Arthur find most worrying. The gang's camp at Clemens Point takes on an increasingly transitory feeling as these various pressures build towards some inevitable confrontation. The beautiful setting with its Spanish moss and gentle lake breezes seems to mock the ugly realities of their situation. They're living in paradise while preparing for war, enjoying peaceful interludes while planning violence, maintaining the appearance of a functional family while watching that family slowly tear itself apart from within. Arthur spends long hours by the lake shore, ostensibly fishing but actually contemplating the choices that have brought them to this point. The journal he keeps hidden in his saddlebags fills with increasingly introspective entries, philosophical musings about loyalty and betrayal, about the difference between living and merely surviving, about what constitutes a life worth remembering when that life is measured not in years, but in acts of conscience and moments of genuine connection with others. The deeper they explore this new criminal landscape, the clearer it becomes that they're not just fighting for survival anymore. They're fighting for the right to define themselves on their own terms rather than accepting the roles that others have assigned them in a larger drama, whose ending has already been written by forces beyond their control. The first successful job after Blackwater comes like rain after a long drought, washing away months of doubt and fear with the sweet taste of familiar victory. It starts simple enough, the way the best jobs always do. Arthur and John, riding the dusty trails around Valentine, happen upon a train carrying Leviticus Cornwall's payroll through the heart of the Heartlands. Not the massive score that Dutch dreams about, but substantial enough to prove that they haven't lost their touch, that the Van der Linde gang still possesses the skills that made them legends in their own time. The robbery itself unfolds with the clockwork precision of a well-rehearsed dance. Dutch takes point as the charming gentleman bandit, his cultured voice and theatrical gestures transforming what could be a terrifying experience into something almost entertaining for the passengers. Arthur and John handle the practical elements, moving through the cars with professional efficiency, collecting valuables while keeping nervous travelers calm with quiet words and steady hands. Bill Williamson and Micah Bell secure the locomotive, ensuring that the engineer doesn't develop any heroic notions about escaping or calling for help. $20,000. That's what they walk away with when the smoke clears and the train continues its journey toward Valentine, poorer but largely unharmed. It's not the fortune Dutch envisioned, but it's enough to keep them fed, armed and mobile for several months. More importantly, it proves that their methods still work, that careful planning and coordinated execution can overcome the advantages of modern law enforcement. But the real discoveries that emerge from this job have nothing to do with money. The first comes from Arthur's careful examination of the train's passenger manifest, a detailed document that reveals more about their target than any of them initially realized. Leviticus Cornwall isn't just another wealthy businessman shipping money from one city to another. He's something far more significant and far more dangerous. He's a captain of industry, a man whose financial empire spans multiple states and whose political connections reach into the highest levels of government. Cornwall owns railroads, oil wells, factories, and mines. His companies employ thousands of workers and generate millions of dollars in revenue each year. More troubling still, his business interests seem to align perfectly with the forces that have been making life increasingly difficult for outlaws like themselves. Cornwall profits from the expansion of federal authority because federal authority protects his investments. He benefits from improved communication and transportation networks because those networks serve his commercial empire. In robbing Cornwall's train, they haven't just stolen money, they've declared war on everything he represents. Arthur brings this intelligence back to camp with growing unease gnawing at his conscience. There's something different about targeting a man like Cornwall, something that goes beyond their traditional practice of stealing from banks and wealthy travelers. Those earlier victims, for all their privilege and prosperity, existed within the same world as the Van der Linde gang. They understood the rules of the frontier, accepted that a certain amount of lawlessness came with the territory, and generally didn't have the resources or inclination to pursue personal vendettas against their robbers. Cornwall operates by different rules entirely. He possesses the wealth to hire armies of private detectives, the political connections to mobilize federal resources for personal use, and most dangerously, the vindictive personality to turn their conflict into a personal crusade. Arthur realizes, with the clarity that comes from years of experience reading dangerous men, that they've just made an enemy who won't be satisfied with simple justice. Cornwall will want revenge, and he has the resources to get it. The second discovery emerges from an unexpected source. Thomas Downs, a struggling farmer who owes the gang money from a previous loan, provides a window into the human cost of their chosen profession that Arthur finds increasingly difficult to ignore. Downs is clearly sick, probably with tuberculosis, his pale complexion and persistent cough marking him as a man living on borrowed time. But he's also clearly desperate, working land that barely produces enough to feed his family while trying to repay debts that grow larger with each passing month. Arthur's collection visit to the Downs homestead starts routinely enough. A few threats, perhaps a demonstration of physical force, and most debtors find ways to produce money they previously claimed not to have. But Downs proves different. He's genuinely broke, his farm genuinely failing, his family genuinely facing starvation, if Arthur takes what little they have left. Worse still, he coughs blood on Arthur during their confrontation, a detail that seems insignificant at the time, but will prove fateful in the months ahead. The encounter forces Arthur to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of his work. When did collecting debts from struggling farmers become part of the noble outlaw life that Dutch preaches? How does intimidating sick men and hungry families serve their cause of fighting against an unjust system? The Downs family represents everything Dutch claims to protect. They're honest people trying to make honest livings in a world that seems determined to crush such ambitions. Yet here is Arthur, acting as the agent of that very crushing force. These moral complications multiply as the gang establishes its routine at Horseshoe Overlook. Each successful job brings money and temporary security, but it also brings attention from increasingly sophisticated opponents. The local sheriff in Valentine proves more competent than expected, asking pointed questions about strangers in the area and maintaining detailed records of unusual activities. Railroad companies begin coordinating their security efforts, sharing information about robbery techniques and suspect descriptions across multiple lines. Most troubling of all, Micah Bell's influence over Dutch continues to grow with each passing week. Where Hosea once offered counsel born from 2 decades of shared experience, Micah provides validation for Dutch's darkest impulses. When Dutch proposes increasingly violent solutions to their problems, Micah enthusiastically agrees. When Dutch dismisses Hosea's cautious advice, Micah reinforces those dismissals with arguments about strength and decisiveness. When Dutch begins to question whether their old methods are sufficient for their current challenges, Micah suggests that perhaps their methods haven't been ruthless enough. Arthur watches this dynamic develop with growing alarm. He's known Micah for only a few months, but he's known Dutch for 15 years. He can see changes in the gang's leader that go beyond simple stress or temporary frustration. Dutch's famous charm is taking on a harder edge, his philosophical speeches acquiring undertones of paranoia and self-justification. The man who once spoke eloquently about fighting for freedom and justice now talks more frequently about survival and strength, about the necessity of doing whatever it takes to protect their way of life. The third significant discovery emerges from an unexpected encounter with government agents operating in the area. Not Pinkertons exactly, but federal marshals working in coordination with local law enforcement to investigate what they term organized criminal enterprises. Arthur overhears enough of their conversation to understand that the Van der Linde gang represents something new in their experience, something that requires new methods and new levels of coordination to address effectively. These agents speak in the language of bureaucracy rather than frontier justice. They discuss the gang not as individual criminals to be captured or killed, but as a system to be dismantled through systematic investigation and strategic pressure. They have files on each gang member, detailed analyses of their methods and patterns, and most unnervingly, theories about their psychological motivations and likely future actions. It's law enforcement as science rather than art, and it represents a fundamental shift in the relationship between outlaws and the authorities who pursue them. The implications of this approach terrify Arthur in ways that simple manhunts never could. Traditional law enforcement could be evaded through superior mobility, firepower, or local knowledge, but systematic investigation couldn't be outgunned or outridden. It could only be escaped through complete abandonment of their current identities and way of life, precisely the kind of fundamental change that Dutch refuses to contemplate. As spring turns towards summer at Horseshoe Overlook, these discoveries coalesce into a growing sense of unease that Arthur struggles to articulate even to himself. They're still successful, still feared and respected throughout the region. Their camp remains secure, their funds adequate, their spirits generally high. By any traditional measure, the Van der Linde gang continues to thrive despite the setback at Blackwater. But Arthur's instincts, honed by 15 years of reading dangerous situations, tell him that something fundamental has shifted in their favor, and not for the better. The world is closing in around them with methodical precision, and their traditional responses to such pressure may no longer be sufficient to ensure their survival. The question isn't whether they can continue their current way of life, but how long they can continue it before the accumulated weight of their enemies finally proves too much to bear. That reckoning, Arthur suspects, is coming sooner than any of them are prepared to face. The return to American soil brings no relief from the pressures that have been building within the Van der Linde gang, like steam in a boiler with a faulty valve. If anything, their homecoming intensifies the contradictions that Gorma temporarily obscured, forcing them to confront the reality that their problems were never geographical but fundamental, rooted in choices and character flaws that no amount of distance can resolve. The gang that stumbles ashore in Louisiana bears little resemblance to the confident organization that once terrorized the frontier with philosophical purpose and tactical brilliance. Beaver Hollow becomes their final stronghold, a cave system in the remote hills of Roanoke Ridge that offers concealment at the cost of comfort and accessibility. The location feels symbolically appropriate for a group that has been driven steadily away from civilization and into increasingly primitive conditions. Where Horseshoe Overlook offered scenic beauty and Clemens Point provided lakeside tranquility, Beaver Hollow delivers only the bare necessities of survival in surroundings that mirror the gang's psychological state. They are literally going underground, hiding in holes like wounded animals while their enemies multiply above ground. Arthur's tuberculosis has progressed beyond the point where concealment remains possible, his deteriorating condition obvious to anyone who observes him for more than a few minutes. The persistent cough that once troubled him occasionally now dominates his daily existence, leaving him gasping for breath after routine activities that should barely challenge a man of his experience and conditioning. The weight loss that was once subtle has become dramatic, transforming his imposing physical presence into something fragile and temporary. But the disease that destroys Arthur's body paradoxically clarifies his moral vision in ways that perfect health never could. Facing the certainty of his own death within months rather than years, he finds himself evaluating every action and relationship through the lens of limited time and ultimate accountability. The philosophical questions that once seemed abstract become intensely practical when viewed from the perspective of someone who will soon have to answer for a lifetime of choices. The conversations that Arthur seeks out during this period reveal his desperate hunger for wisdom that might help him navigate the moral complexity of his situation. Sister Calderone, the nun who ministers to Saint Denis is poor and forgotten, provides perspective on redemption and forgiveness that challenges everything Arthur thought he understood about justice and punishment. Her faith in the possibility of transformation, even for someone with his history of violence, offers hope that seems almost too good to believe but too important to dismiss. Reverend Swanson, despite his own struggles with alcohol and doubt, possesses hard-won insights about the relationship between suffering and wisdom that resonate deeply with Arthur's current experience. The Reverend's journey from certainty through crisis to a more complex understanding of faith mirrors Arthur's own evolution from unquestioning loyalty to painful self-examination. Their conversations around dying campfires become a form of mutual confession, two men approaching the end of their stories seeking absolution from each other since formal forgiveness seems beyond their reach. Even more significant are Arthur's interactions with people outside the gang's immediate circle, individuals whose lives have been touched by their activities, but who represent possibilities for different ways of living. Charlotte Balfour, the widow struggling to survive alone on her homestead, embodies the kind of courage and determination that Arthur respects but has rarely encountered among career criminals. Her willingness to face hardship without compromising her principles provides a model for how one might live with honor even under the most difficult circumstances. The Downs family, whose patriarch Arthur infected with tuberculosis during a debt collection that now seems criminally stupid in retrospect, forces him to confront the human cost of the gang's activities in the most personal possible terms. Mrs. Downs and her son Archie, struggling with poverty and illness that Arthur's actions helped create, represent thousands of innocent people whose lives have been damaged by criminal enterprises justified through elaborate philosophical frameworks. Their forgiveness, when it finally comes, carries more weight than any formal absolution, because it emerges from genuine suffering rather than institutional obligation. These encounters with people living honest lives under difficult circumstances highlight the distance between Dutch's romantic rhetoric about freedom and justice and the actual impact of their activities on the communities they claim to protect. The gang's crimes don't primarily hurt wealthy capitalists or corrupt officials who might deserve such treatment. They hurt struggling farmers, working families, and small business owners whose only crime is existing within range of Dutch's increasingly grandiose schemes. Arthur's growing moral clarity creates increasing tension with Dutch's final descent into paranoid authoritarianism, where Arthur seeks redemption through helping others and making amends for past wrongs. Dutch pursues vindication through ever more violent assertions of his own righteousness. Where Arthur questions the moral foundations of their chosen lifestyle, Dutch doubles down on the philosophical frameworks that justify continued criminality. Where Arthur accepts responsibility for his own choices and their consequences, Dutch blames external enemies for every setback and failure. Micah Bell's influence reaches its zenith during this period, with his counsel becoming indistinguishable from Dutch's own thoughts and preferences. The distinction between advisor and leader blurs as Dutch increasingly speaks in Micah's voice, adopting his crude pragmatism and casual cruelty as if they were his own insights rather than corruption of his original vision. Arthur watches this transformation with growing horror, recognizing that the man he followed for 15 years has been replaced by something alien and dangerous. The plan to rob the Cornwall oil refinery represents everything wrong with Dutch's current thinking, a scheme that prioritizes symbolic value over practical considerations and personal gratification over gang welfare. The target offers little actual wealth compared to the risks involved, but it allows Dutch to strike back at Leviticus Cornwall in a gesture of defiance that serves his psychological needs rather than their financial requirements. The job embodies the transformation of their organization from rational criminal enterprise to vehicle for Dutch's personal vendettas. Arthur's participation in planning this operation despite his growing reservations illustrates the psychological complexity of his position. Part of him still hopes that Dutch might return to his former self if the right circumstances present themselves. Part of him fears that open rebellion might destroy whatever positive elements remain within their organization. But increasingly, part of him recognizes that loyalty to Dutch's original vision requires opposing what Dutch has become, even if such opposition triggers the final collapse of everything they've built together. John Marston's return from federal custody provides both hope and additional complications for Arthur's moral calculations. John's experience in prison has given him perspective on their situation that members who remained with the gang lack. He's seen how the outside world views their activities, witnessed the resources that government authorities can deploy against them, and most importantly, spent months contemplating what kind of future he wants for his family. The reunion between John and his wife Abigail, their son Jack caught between joy at his father's return and fear that he might disappear again, crystallizes everything Arthur hopes to protect through whatever actions he takes in his remaining time. The Marston family represents innocence within their criminal organization, people whose lives might still be saved if the right choices are made by those with the power to influence outcomes. Arthur begins sharing his concerns about Dutch and Micah with other gang members who might be receptive to such warnings, but he does so carefully to avoid triggering the kind of factional violence that could destroy them more quickly than external enemies ever could. Charles Smith's natural wisdom and moral clarity make him a natural ally in any effort to protect vulnerable gang members. Sadie Adler's fierce protectiveness toward people she cares about suggests she might support actions taken in defense of John's family, even if such actions conflict with formal chain of command. But the most important alliance Arthur cultivates during this period is with John himself, as he gradually prepares the younger man to assume responsibilities that extend beyond simple gang membership. Arthur begins teaching John not just tactical skills and survival techniques, but the kind of moral reasoning that might help him avoid the mistakes that have led their organization to its current crisis. The journal that Arthur has kept throughout their adventures becomes a form of moral legacy, its pages filled with hard-won insights about the relationship between loyalty and conscience, strength and cruelty, survival and meaning. The gathering of wisdom that occurs during this final period isn't just Arthur's personal preparation for death and judgment. It's his attempt to distill everything valuable from 15 years of outlaw life into lessons that might help others avoid the moral catastrophes that have consumed so many promising lives. The gang that gathered around Dutch's original vision of freedom and justice contained genuine wisdom about resistance to unjust authority and the importance of chosen family bonds. Arthur's challenge is separating that wisdom from the corruption that has grown around it like cancer, preserving what deserves preservation while honestly confronting what must be abandoned. The approaching confrontation with their enemies, both external and internal, will test everything Arthur has learned about himself and his responsibilities to others. The question is no longer whether the Van der Linde gang will survive, but whether anything worth preserving will emerge from its inevitable destruction. The final preparations unfold with the grim efficiency of men who understand they are arranging their own funeral, each decision carrying the weight of finality that transforms mundane tactical considerations into existential choices about legacy and meaning. Arthur's physical condition has deteriorated to the point where concealment becomes impossible, his skeletal frame and persistent bloody cough marking him as a man whose time can now be measured in weeks rather than months. Yet paradoxically, this approach to death brings a clarity of purpose that perfect health never provided, stripping away illusions and compromises to reveal what truly matters when everything else falls away. The Cornwall oil refinery job represents everything that has gone wrong with Dutch's leadership, a scheme born from personal vendetta rather than practical necessity, designed to satisfy psychological needs rather than address their actual financial situation. The target offers minimal monetary reward compared to the enormous risks involved, but it allows Dutch to strike back at Leviticus Cornwall in a gesture of defiance that serves his wounded ego more than their collective welfare. Arthur recognizes the operation for what it truly is, a suicide mission disguised as strategic brilliance, yet another example of Dutch's growing inability to distinguish between his personal desires and the gang's actual needs. The planning sessions reveal the complete transformation of their decision-making process, from collaborative strategy to authoritarian decree. Where Dutch once sought input from experienced gang members and weighed different perspectives before reaching conclusions, he now announces predetermined plans and expects unquestioning compliance from subordinates whose opinions he no longer values or solicits. Micah Bell's presence during these discussions serves not to provide alternative viewpoints but to validate whatever Dutch has already decided, creating an echo chamber that reinforces poor judgment while silencing voices of experience and caution. Arthur watches these dynamics with growing alarm, understanding that the gang's internal structure has become as toxic as their external situation. The family bonds that once held them together through countless crises have been replaced by fear-based hierarchy that rewards sycophancy while punishing independent thought. Members who once felt free to express dissenting opinions now remain silent to avoid Dutch's increasingly volatile reactions to anything that challenges his authority or questions his wisdom. The corruption of their organizational culture creates cascading problems that extend far beyond simple tactical mistakes. Younger gang members who might have learned valuable lessons from experienced criminals instead absorb lessons about blind obedience and the dangers of questioning authority. The practical knowledge that once passed naturally from veteran outlaws to novices gets lost when honest communication becomes subordinated to political considerations about who Dutch favors and what opinions he wants to hear. Arthur's conversations with individual gang members during this period reveal the psychological toll that their situation has taken on everyone involved. Charles Smith, with his natural wisdom and moral compass, expresses growing unease about their trajectory while maintaining loyalty to people he cares about within the organization. His mixed heritage has taught him to navigate complex loyalties and competing obligations, but even his diplomatic skills struggle with the contradictions that now define their daily existence. Sadie Adler's enthusiasm for violent solutions, initially understandable given her personal losses, has evolved into something more troubling. As she embraces the gang's darkest impulses with increasing fervor, her transformation from grieving widow to hardened killer illustrates how exposure to criminal culture can corrupt even people with legitimate grievances against unjust systems. Arthur sees in her trajectory a warning about what he himself might have become if different circumstances had shaped his early development. John Marston's position becomes increasingly precarious as Dutch's paranoia focuses on anyone who might challenge his authority or provide alternative leadership for the remaining gang members. John's natural leadership qualities, once viewed as assets for the organization's future, now make him a potential threat to Dutch's absolute control. The very characteristics that might allow John to guide survivors toward better lives make him dangerous in Dutch's current psychological state. The preparation of contingency plans occupies much of Arthur's remaining energy as he tries to create opportunities for others to escape the disaster he sees approaching. His journal becomes filled with detailed instructions about safe routes, reliable contacts, and hidden resources that might help gang members who choose to abandon their current lifestyle. These preparations require careful discretion since Dutch views any planning for life after the gang as treasonous thinking that threatens group cohesion. Arthur's physical limitations force him to delegate responsibilities he once handled personally, creating opportunities to mentor younger gang members in skills that extend beyond simple criminal techniques. He teaches survival skills, moral reasoning, and the kind of practical wisdom that might help them avoid the mistakes that have consumed so many promising lives. These lessons often come disguised as routine instruction about weapons maintenance or camp security, allowing him to pass on valuable knowledge without triggering Dutch's suspicions about disloyalty. The approach to their final confrontation with external enemies takes on ceremonial significance as Arthur contemplates the legacy he wants to leave behind. His choices during whatever time remains will define not just his own fate but potentially the futures of people he cares about, who might still escape the cycles of violence and retribution that have defined their shared existence. The weight of these responsibilities feels heavier than any physical burden he's ever carried, yet also more meaningful than anything he's previously attempted. The recognition that his own redemption might come through ensuring others' salvation transforms Arthur's relationship with his approaching death from desperate fear to something approaching acceptance. If his remaining weeks can create opportunities for John's family to escape their current circumstances, if his sacrifice might protect innocent people from the consequences of Dutch's increasingly erratic decisions, then perhaps his life might ultimately serve some purpose beyond simple survival and accumulation of criminal victories. Dutch's final descent into paranoid authoritarianism accelerates during this period, as external pressures combine with internal contradictions to create a psychological pressure cooker that threatens to explode at any moment. His speeches to the gang take on increasingly grandiose and disconnected qualities, filled with philosophical abstractions that bear little relationship to their actual situation. The man who once inspired loyalty through charismatic leadership now demands obedience through emotional manipulation and implied threats. The Cornwall oil refinery operation becomes a test of loyalty that Dutch uses to identify potential dissidents within their ranks. Anyone who questions the wisdom of the plan or suggests alternative approaches gets marked as unreliable, potentially traitorous elements who threaten group unity. This paranoid logic creates a spiral of mistrust that makes honest communication impossible while ensuring that poor decisions go unchallenged by people who might otherwise provide valuable perspective. Arthur's preparations for what he suspects will be his final operation take on ritual significance, as he attempts to reconcile his violent past with his hopes for others' futures. The weapons he cleans and maintains represent tools that have taken countless lives, yet they might also serve to protect innocent people during whatever chaos lies ahead. The moral complexity of using violence to create space for others to escape violence illustrates the paradoxes that have always defined their existence as outlaws with consciences. The letters Arthur writes during this period, carefully hidden among his personal effects, represent his attempt to communicate truths that might otherwise die with him. Messages for John about leadership and responsibility, warnings about Dutch's psychological state, and expressions of love for people who have meant more to him than he ever learned to articulate while they could still hear such words. These final communications serve as both practical guidance and emotional legacy, preserving insights that might help others avoid the mistakes that have led their organization to its current crisis. The approaching truth that Arthur dreads yet feels compelled to confront centers not on their external enemies or even their internal betrayals, but on the fundamental question of whether their chosen way of life was ever compatible with the moral values they claim to uphold. The answer to that question will determine not just how their story ends, but what meaning can be extracted from 15 years of choices that have brought them to this moment of reckoning. The final confrontation arrives not with the dramatic fanfare that Dutch's grand pronouncements might suggest, but with the inexorable certainty of storm clouds gathering on a horizon that has been darkening for months. The Cornwall oil refinery operation unfolds exactly as Arthur predicted it would, a tactical success that becomes a strategic disaster, yielding minimal financial reward while triggering massive retaliation from enemies who possess resources that dwarf anything the Van der Linde gang can muster in response. But the job's failure pales in comparison to the revelation that emerges from its aftermath, a truth so devastating that it reshapes everything Arthur thought he understood about their situation and the forces that have been manipulating them from within. Micah Bell's treachery, suspected for months but never conclusively proven, reveals itself through accumulating evidence that becomes impossible to dismiss even by someone as psychologically invested in denial as Dutch van der Linde. The discovery comes not through dramatic confrontation, but through careful observation of details that individually might be explained by coincidence, but collectively form a pattern of betrayal, so systematic that it could only have been orchestrated by someone with intimate knowledge of their operations and psychology. Micah's suggestions, when examined retrospectively, consistently led them toward courses of action that increased their exposure to law enforcement, while appearing to serve their immediate tactical needs. Arthur pieces together the timeline of their destruction with the methodical precision of a man who understands that documentation of the truth might be his final gift to survivors who will need to understand how their family was torn apart from within. The Blackwater ferry job, their original disaster, collapsed in ways that suggested their enemies possessed detailed advanced knowledge of timing, personnel, and escape routes. The subsequent jobs that Micah influenced or directly planned all followed similar patterns, succeeding just enough to maintain credibility while ultimately worsening their strategic position. The psychological manipulation that Micah employed to gain and maintain Dutch's trust reveals itself as a masterwork of criminal tradecraft, exploiting specific weaknesses in Dutch's character that someone with professional training might identify and systematically exploit. Where Hosea offered gentle criticism that challenged Dutch to examine his own assumptions, Micah provided constant validation that reinforced Dutch's worst impulses while making him increasingly dependent on external approval for his sense of self-worth. The revelation that their organization has been compromised from within transforms every memory of recent events, casting previous experiences in new light that makes their hidden meanings suddenly obvious. Conversations that seem to demonstrate Micah's loyalty now reveal themselves as information-gathering exercises designed to identify vulnerabilities and exploit them for maximum damage. Tactical suggestions that appeared to show concern for gang welfare now obviously serve to position them for more effective surveillance and eventual capture. Arthur's confrontation with this truth occurs simultaneously with the final collapse of his physical health, his tubercular symptoms reaching the point where continued activity becomes a matter of willpower rather than bodily capability. The disease that has been consuming him for months now races toward its inevitable conclusion, leaving him gasping for breath after minimal exertion, while his skeletal frame provides stark visual evidence of his approaching death. Yet the proximity of his own end brings unexpected clarity about priorities and responsibilities that might have remained muddled if he possessed more time to deliberate and second-guess his instincts. The choice between loyalty to Dutch and protection of innocent people resolves itself with crystalline simplicity when viewed from the perspective of someone who will soon have to answer for a lifetime of moral decisions. Arthur's remaining weeks or days must serve purposes beyond mere survival if they are to have any meaning at all. The final conversation between Arthur and Dutch unfolds with all the tragic inevitability of Greek drama. Two men who once shared genuine affection and mutual respect, now separated by choices and revelations that make reconciliation impossible. Dutch's psychological investment in Micah's counsel has reached the point where acknowledging the betrayal would require admitting errors of judgment so fundamental that they would destroy his sense of himself as a capable leader and moral authority. Arthur watches his surrogate father choose Micah over truth, loyalty to delusion over acceptance of reality, with the heartbreak of someone who finally understands that love alone cannot save people from the consequences of their own character flaws. The man who rescued him from meaningless existence 15 years ago has been replaced by someone whose desperate need for validation makes him vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation that Micah represents. The violence that erupts from this confrontation feels both shocking and inevitable, the logical conclusion of tensions that have been building since Blackwater transformed their organization from functional criminal enterprise into vehicle for Dutch's increasingly destructive psychological needs. Arthur finds himself forced to choose between the man who gave his life meaning and the people whose futures might still be salvaged from the wreckage of their shared dreams. His decision to help John Marston escape rather than pursuing the Blackwater money represents the culmination of months of moral evolution that began with his tuberculosis diagnosis and accelerated through countless small revelations about the true nature of their activities and relationships. The fortune that once seemed like their salvation now appears as what it always was: blood money that could never purchase the kind of peace and security that healthy families actually need. The physical confrontation that follows Arthur's choice plays out across the landscape that has defined their existence for years, taking them from the caves of Beaver Hollow through forests and hills that hold memories of better times when their organization served purposes beyond simple survival and mutual destruction. Each location carries weight from previous experiences, transforming the chase into a retrospective journey through the geography of their shared history. Arthur's final battle with Micah Bell occurs against the backdrop of sunrise over the Cumberland Forest, the natural beauty of the setting providing ironic contrast to the ugliness of the conflict itself. Two men who represent opposite approaches to criminal life, one seeking redemption through sacrifice and the other embracing corruption through betrayal, settle their differences with the crude finality that has always lurked beneath whatever philosophical veneer their organization claimed to maintain. The revelation that reshapes everything extends beyond simple questions of loyalty and betrayal to encompass fundamental issues about the nature of authority, the meaning of family, and the possibility of moral growth, even under the most difficult circumstances. Arthur's transformation from unquestioning enforcer to conscience-driven protector illustrates the potential for change that exists even in people whose histories seem to preclude such development. Dutch's final appearance in this climactic sequence, his choice to walk away, rather than help either combatant, provides the ultimate demonstration of how completely his character has been corrupted by self-interest and psychological manipulation. The man who once spoke eloquently about the importance of family loyalty abandons his most faithful son in favor of preserving relationships that serve his immediate psychological needs, rather than honoring bonds forged through years of shared sacrifice. Arthur's death, when it finally comes, carries meaning that transcends the simple end of biological function to become a statement about the possibility of redemption, even for people whose choices have caused enormous harm to others. His final moments, spent ensuring John's escape rather than seeking medical attention that might prolong his own existence, demonstrate the kind of moral clarity that emerges when someone finally understands what truly matters and possesses the courage to act on that understanding. The journal that Arthur leaves behind serves as more than simple documentation of events. It becomes a moral legacy that preserves hard-won insights about the relationship between loyalty and conscience, strength and cruelty, survival and meaning. Its pages contain the distilled wisdom of someone who learned too late how to live properly but used his final opportunities to help others avoid similar mistakes. The larger revelation that emerges from Arthur's death concerns the nature of heroism itself and the possibility that moral greatness might emerge from the most unlikely sources. A man who spent 15 years as an enforcer for criminal enterprises discovers in his final weeks that true strength comes not from the ability to inflict violence, but from the willingness to accept personal sacrifice in service of others' welfare. The gang that scattered after this climactic confrontation carries with them not just the practical knowledge needed for survival, but the example of someone who chose conscience over comfort, principle over expedience, love over fear. Arthur Morgan's legacy extends beyond the immediate rescue of John Marston's family to encompass broader questions about redemption, responsibility, and the possibility of moral transformation, even under the most challenging circumstances. That legacy would shape not just the choices of immediate survivors, but the larger story of the American frontier, as it struggled to define what kind of civilization would emerge from the chaos of rapid change and competing visions of progress and justice. 8 years pass like water flowing over stones, each season carrying away more memories of the Van der Linde gang, until their exploits fade into the kind of half-remembered legends that frontier communities share around winter fires. John Marston builds the life that Arthur died to make possible, carving out a homestead called Beecher's Hope from New Austin rangeland, where the wind carries no echoes of their violent past. The ranch that emerges from his labor represents everything the gang once claimed to fight for but never achieved. Honest work rewarded with genuine security, family bonds strengthened through shared purpose rather than strained by criminal necessity. The transition from outlaw to rancher proves more difficult than John initially imagined, requiring him to learn skills that 15 years of gunfighting and bank robbing never provided. Fence building, cattle management, crop rotation, and 100 other mundane tasks that sustain agricultural life demand patience and consistency, rather than the explosive violence that once defined his existence. But Abigail's quiet strength and Jack's growing intelligence provide motivation for persistence through challenges that once might have driven him back to easier but ultimately destructive solutions. The domestic peace that John constructs feels fragile at first, like something that might be shattered by a single mistake or moment of weakness. Every stranger who approaches their property triggers instincts developed during years of being hunted by determined enemies. Every unexpected noise in the night brings hands reaching for weapons that hopefully will never again be needed for anything more serious than dealing with wolves or rustlers. The psychological transition from constant vigilance to relative security requires almost as much effort as learning legitimate trades. Yet gradually, the rhythms of honest living begin to feel natural rather than artificial, as if the outlaw years were an extended nightmare from which John has finally awakened to discover his true identity. Sunrise means feeding livestock rather than planning robberies. Sunset brings family meals and quiet conversations instead of campfire planning sessions for violent enterprises. The calendar follows natural cycles of planting and harvest rather than artificial schedules imposed by criminal opportunities and law enforcement pressure. Jack Marston grows into adolescence with only fragmentary memories of their outlaw period, his understanding of their past shaped more by carefully edited stories than direct experience of violence and upheaval. John and Abigail collaborate in creating a version of their history that preserves important lessons about loyalty and courage, while shielding their son from knowledge that might corrupt his developing moral framework. The boy who once played with wooden toys while his father planned bank robberies now reads books and dreams of becoming a writer, his intellectual development following paths that would have been impossible during their criminal years. But the past proves impossible to escape entirely, despite John's sincere efforts to build a completely new life based on legitimate principles. The skills that made him valuable as an outlaw, his ability to read dangerous situations and respond to threats with decisive action, remain part of his character even when directed toward protective rather than predatory purposes. The psychological transformation from criminal to citizen involves suppressing certain capabilities rather than eliminating them entirely. The federal agents who eventually arrive at Beecher's Hope represent everything that has changed about law enforcement since the gang's heyday, their professional manner and systematic approach illustrating how completely the frontier period has ended. These aren't the easily intimidated local sheriffs of the 1890s, but trained investigators with access to modern communication networks and bureaucratic resources that make traditional outlaw tactics obsolete. They know everything about John's past, because institutional memory now preserves such information indefinitely. Edgar Ross and Archer Fordham embody the new order that has replaced the chaotic democracy of the frontier period. Government officials whose authority derives from legal structures rather than personal charisma or physical prowess. Their polite but implacable demands illustrate how completely the world has changed since Dutch van der Linde first began building his gang of philosophical outlaws. There is no longer space in American society for the kind of independent criminal enterprises that once flourished in the absence of effective federal coordination. The ultimatum they present to John forces him to choose between the family he's built and the loyalty he still feels towards surviving members of his outlaw past. Find and eliminate Bill Williamson, Javier Escuela, and Dutch van der Linde, or watch everything he's constructed during 8 years of honest living get destroyed by legal mechanisms that he has no power to resist. The choice isn't really a choice at all, since refusing would accomplish nothing, except ensuring that his family suffers for decisions made during a period of his life they had no part in creating. John's reluctant return to violence occurs against the backdrop of a Mexico consumed by revolutionary chaos, where competing factions battle for control of territory and ideology, while ordinary citizens suffer the consequences of decisions made by leaders who view human life as expendable resource in pursuit of abstract political goals. The setting provides ironic commentary on Dutch's revolutionary pretensions, illustrating what actual political upheaval looks like when divorced from the romantic rhetoric that once made outlaw life seem philosophically meaningful. The confrontation with Bill Williamson reveals how completely their old gang bonds have deteriorated in the absence of shared purpose and mutual respect. Bill's descent into simple banditry, his alliance with Mexican criminals whose methods would have horrified their younger selves, demonstrates what happens when the philosophical framework that once justified their actions gets stripped away to reveal the crude violence that always lurked beneath their noble pronouncements. Javier Escuela's capture proves even more painful for John, since it involves betraying someone who once fought beside him as a brother during their most dangerous adventures. The Mexican revolutionary who followed Dutch north in search of a different kind of freedom has become just another criminal whose methods serve no purpose beyond personal enrichment and political manipulation. His fall from idealistic rebel to pragmatic survivor illustrates the corrupting influence of prolonged exposure to violence without moral constraints. But the final confrontation with Dutch van der Linde himself provides the most devastating evidence of how completely their organization's original vision has collapsed into nihilistic self-destruction. The man who once inspired loyalty through charismatic leadership and philosophical sophistication has devolved into something approaching madness, his grand speeches about freedom and justice replaced by paranoid rants about persecution and betrayal. The Dutch that John encounters in the mountains above Blackwater bears only superficial resemblance to the leader who once rescued him from meaningless existence. Their last conversation unfolds with all the tragic inevitability of Greek drama, two men who once shared genuine affection now separated by choices and circumstances that make reconciliation impossible. Dutch's final words, his acknowledgement that their dreams were always doomed to failure, carry the weight of epitaph for an entire way of life that the modern world has rendered obsolete. His death, when it comes, feels less like victory than like the closing of a book whose final chapters were written in blood and regret. John's return to Beecher's Hope should represent triumph, the successful completion of his bargain with federal authorities, and the final securing of his family's future. Instead, it brings the terrible knowledge that some debts can never be fully repaid, some pasts never completely escaped. The men he killed to purchase his family's safety were once his brothers, and their blood stains his hands in ways that honest work can never entirely cleanse. The domestic peace that follows his return carries undertones of melancholy that reflect his growing understanding of the true cost of their outlaw years. Arthur's sacrifice made John's legitimate life possible, but it couldn't eliminate the psychological scars left by 15 years of violence and moral compromise. The ranch that represents his redemption also serves as memorial to everyone who died during their organization's long collapse into chaos and betrayal. The federal agents who promised to leave him alone proved, predictably, to be liars whose word carries no more weight than the paper their agreements are written on. Edgar Ross's return to Beecher's Hope with a new ultimatum illustrates the fundamental truth about government power that Dutch's philosophy never adequately addressed. Institutions possess advantages in patience and resources that individual resistance can delay but never ultimately defeat. The final shootout that claims John's life unfolds with the same inexorable logic that destroyed Arthur Morgan and Dutch van der Linde before him. There is no escape from the past for men whose histories involve the kind of violence that leaves permanent marks on institutional memory. The peace that John bought with 8 years of honest living proves temporary, purchased on credit that eventually comes due with interest that no amount of legitimate success can satisfy. Jack Marston's inheritance includes not just the ranch that his father built, but the burden of understanding that violence creates cycles of retribution that can span generations. The boy who grew up reading books while others planned crimes must now choose whether to continue those cycles or find some way to break them through different responses to injustice and loss. The resolution of the van der Linde gang's story extends beyond individual fates to encompass broader questions about the nature of American civilization and the place of violence in social change. Their dream of living outside conventional society's constraints while maintaining moral superiority to the systems they rejected proved impossible to sustain when tested by the practical necessities of survival and the psychological pressures of being hunted by superior forces. What emerges from their collective tragedy is not simple condemnation of their choices, but recognition of the complex relationship between individual agency and historical forces, between personal responsibility and social circumstances, between the dream of freedom and the reality of power in its various forms. The sun rises over New Austin for the 10,000th time since Dutch van der Linde first began gathering lost souls around his campfire, its golden light spreading across landscapes that have witnessed the birth and death of legends, the rise and fall of dreams that seemed as eternal as the mountains themselves. The wind that stirs the grass carries no memory of gunshots or dying words, no echo of philosophical speeches or desperate promises. It simply blows as wind has always blown, indifferent to human ambition and human suffering alike, following patterns older than any story men tell themselves about meaning and purpose. Jack Marston stands at his father's grave as morning shadows retreat toward the eastern horizon, his young face bearing expressions that combine grief with something deeper and more complex. The wooden cross that marks John Marston's final resting place speaks only of dates and simple facts, revealing nothing about the man who chose to face impossible odds rather than spend his remaining years looking over his shoulder for enemies who would never stop hunting him. But Jack carries within himself the living memory of a father who ultimately chose sacrifice over survival, principle over pragmatism, love over fear. The ranch that John built through 8 years of honest labor continues its daily rhythms despite the absence of its creator, cattle moving across pastures where wildflowers bloom in cycles that stretch back to times before any human foot disturbed these ancient soils. The fences that John mended and the barns that he raised serve purposes that transcend their builder's mortality, sheltering animals and crops that will feed families long after everyone who remembers his name has joined him in whatever country lies beyond the sunset. Abigail Marston tends her garden with the patient devotion of someone who understands that growth requires both time and faith, her weathered hands coaxing life from earth that has absorbed the blood of too many good men who died before their time. The vegetables she grows and the flowers she nurtures represent quiet victories over the forces of destruction that claimed her husband and so many others she loved. Each tomato that ripens, each rose that blooms, stands as testimony to the persistence of life in the face of seemingly overwhelming odds. The federal agents who orchestrated John's death have moved on to other cases, other enemies of progress, who must be eliminated in service of a vision of American civilization that admits no space for independent spirits or alternative ways of living. Edgar Ross pursues his career advancement with the same methodical determination that once focused on destroying the van der Linde gang, His bureaucratic success built on foundations of carefully forgotten violence and conveniently overlooked moral compromises. But the consequences of their actions ripple outward like stones thrown into still water, creating patterns of cause and effect that will eventually return to disturb their own carefully constructed lives. Jack Marston grows into young adulthood, carrying knowledge about the relationship between power and justice that government schools never teach, understanding truths about American democracy that most citizens never discover. His education in the realities of federal authority was purchased with his father's blood, lessons that burn with the clarity of personal loss rather than abstract political theory. The West itself transforms around these human dramas with the inexorable patience of geological time, railroad lines connecting distant territories, while telegraph wires carry news and commerce at speeds that compress space and time in ways that once seemed magical. Towns that existed as collections of wooden buildings and muddy streets, when Dutch first began preaching his philosophy of resistance, now boast electric lights and paved roads, banks and schools and churches that speak of permanent settlement rather than temporary convenience. The old ways die harder in some places than others. Remote valleys and hidden canyons where men still settle disputes with handguns rather than lawyers, where reputation matters more than legal documentation, where loyalty and courage count for more than wealth and social position. These pockets of frontier culture persist like wildflowers growing between railroad ties, beautiful and doomed, maintained by people who choose difficult independence over comfortable conformity. Charles Smith finds his own peace among the Wapiti people, his mixed heritage allowing him to bridge worlds that seem increasingly incompatible, as American expansion accelerates toward its inevitable conclusion. His quiet wisdom and natural skill with weapons serve protective rather than predatory purposes now, helping tribal communities navigate the treacherous political landscape that threatens their survival. The violence he learned during his outlaw years becomes a tool for preserving rather than destroying, protecting ancient ways of life that offer alternatives to the mechanical efficiency of modern civilization. Sadie Adler carves out her own legend as a bounty hunter, whose reputation for relentless pursuit and frontier justice attracts clients willing to pay premium prices for services that more conventional law enforcement cannot or will not provide. Her transformation from grieving widow to avenging angel illustrates possibilities for reinvention that the frontier offered to people willing to embrace its dangers along with its freedoms. The gang that gave her purpose when she had nothing left to lose taught her skills that serve her well in a profession where survival depends on being faster and more determined than the criminals she hunts. The money that once seemed so important, the thousands of dollars stolen from banks and trains and wealthy travelers, proves as ephemeral as morning mist when viewed from the perspective of decades rather than desperate moments. Fortunes that men died to protect or steal get spent or lost or forgotten, while the relationships forged through shared danger and mutual dependence leave marks that last long after the gold has tarnished and the paper currency has crumbled to dust. Arthur Morgan's journal, discovered years later in a forgotten saddlebag, provides historians and curious readers with insights into the psychology of men who chose to live outside society's boundaries during America's transition from frontier democracy to industrial empire. His careful observations about wildlife and weather, his sketches of landscapes and portraits of companions, his philosophical musings about loyalty and conscience, preserve perspectives that official records never capture. The enforcer, who rarely spoke of his inner life in conversation, reveals through written words a depth of thought and feeling that surprises everyone who knew him only through his reputation for violence. The graves that dot the landscape from Blackwater to Strawberry, from Valentine to St. Denis, mark the final resting places of men and women who bet everything on Dutch van der Linde's vision of freedom and lost. But their deaths were not meaningless if they contributed to stories that help others understand the true costs of violence and the genuine value of peace. Every cross that weathers in frontier cemeteries speaks to dreams that reached too high and ambitions that demanded too much, but also to courage that faced impossible odds and loyalty that endured beyond death itself. As evening approaches over the vast expanse of the American frontier, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold that reminded Arthur Morgan of sunsets shared around countless campfires, the wind carries the whispered promise that every ending becomes a beginning, every conclusion creates space for new stories to unfold. The age of the gunslinger passes into legend and memory, but the questions that drove Dutch van der Linde to gather his surrogate family remain as relevant as ever. How do we balance individual freedom with collective responsibility? How do we resist unjust authority without becoming what we oppose? How do we preserve what is valuable from the past while adapting to necessary changes in the present? These challenges transcend any particular historical period or geographical location, speaking to eternal tensions that define the human condition itself. The stars that emerge as darkness settles over the rangeland shine with the same light that guided Arthur Morgan through his final weeks of moral awakening, and guided John Marston through 8 years of honest living, and guided Jack Marston toward whatever future awaits beyond the horizon of our story. Their brilliance reminds us that some things endure beyond individual lives and particular circumstances, that beauty and meaning persist even when the people who recognized and preserved them have returned to the earth that gave them birth. So rest now, traveler, as the campfire burns low and the night sounds of the frontier create their ancient symphony of wind through grass and distant coyote calls, and the gentle breathing of horses at rest. Let these stories of loyalty and betrayal, courage and failure, dreams pursued and prices paid, settle into that place where legends dwell until someone calls them forth again to illuminate new challenges with old wisdom. The West remembers everything and forgives much, holding space for all who rode its trails in search of something better than what they left behind. In that vast forgiveness, perhaps, lies the closest thing to redemption that any of us can hope to find.